In the beginning, there were no walls between gods and men, only breath, shadow, and the rhythm of flesh beneath sunlight. The land was not called Greece then. It was a scattering of hills and islands, of groves where bees whispered to fig trees, and coastlines where salt lived forever on the skin. In these places, before temples stood and philosophers argued under colonnades, EX was not a word but a gesture, a look that lingered too long, a hand that remained on a shoulder during silence. It was everywhere and nowhere, named in hymns yet spoken only in dusk. The earliest accounts of EX are not written, but carved in wind on stone. On the Cycladic Islands, marble figures without mouths held their bellies or tilted their heads in frozen desire. Archaeologists called them idols. They were more than that, they were echoes of the first agreements made in flesh. The ancients did not separate the sacred from the sensual. A priestess could cleanse herself in olive oil before a ceremony, not to purify, but to shine. To gleam was to be chosen, and to be chosen meant one was seen. And to be seen was already to begin. In Delphi, beneath the oracle stone, there were chambers deep, humming with sulfur where EX was practiced not for pleasure, but prophecy. Men and women lay beneath vapor, touching not for climax but for vision. The seers said that to merge bodies was to blur time, to glimpse what the gods had not yet allowed. And sometimes, those who touched in the dark came back speaking languages they never learned, crying for cities that did not exist. The concept of EX in Athens was layered in folds: fold of robe, fold of mind, fold of law. There were courtesans called hetairae, who conversed before they caressed, whose intellect aroused more than the body ever could. Men visited them to be touched where reason lived, and in their presence, even the boldest warrior became uncertain, trembling not from battle, but from the quiet knowledge that desire could reside in syllables. But beyond the city walls, EX was simpler. A shepherd might sing into the wind, hoping someone heard, and when another voice responded, no matter how distant, the hills bent inward with anticipation. In the olive groves, hands spoke in place of mouths. There were no terms like gender or identity, only the moment when two people found themselves warm under the same moon and wondered what it meant to exist so close. In Sparta, EX was sharpened like their blades. Boys grew with boys, trained naked under stars, their bodies colliding in sweat and discipline. Love was encouraged among them, for it built loyalty, and loyalty built survival. A warrior who fought beside his lover fought without fear. Yet EX was not soft, Herod was packed. It was oath. It was flame that burned if broken. In the mountain village of Thassos, an old scroll speaks of a woman who never married, but who knew every man in her village by name and by breath. They say she kept a book under her pillow, each name written not in ink, but in color. Red for fire, blue for sorrow, gold for the ones who stayed. No one judged her. She was the village's memory, and every child, born or unborn, belonged in part to her gaze. Temples were not exempt. The cult of Aphrodite in Corinth held rituals where EX was a form of worship. Those who entered the temple shed more than their garments. They shed the distance between divinity and desire. To lie with a priestess was not sin. It was elevation. The body, intention, and tremble became offering. And in the morning, the air smelled of rosewater and iron. Yet there were shadows. Not all EX was equal. Power could mask itself as devotion. In some accounts, a king claimed the right to every bride before her husband. In others, a general demanded loyalty through touch. There were laments sung by women who did not consent, whose silence became heritage, their voices buried in myth, until the myth broke and bled. There were also unions that defied rules. 2 women ran away from Athens and lived in a cave near the sea, carving verses into stone with salt-wet fingers. Their poems were found centuries later, still readable. They wrote of hair in moonlight, of shoulders curved like waves, of mornings that began not with sun, but with sigh. The village that once condemned them now tells their story at festivals, though they never use their names. Naming would be too loud. The symposium's drunken gatherings of the elite held EX like a game. Conversation flowed, but so did touches under tables, glances behind fans, challenges made with eyes. A man might recite poetry to another, and if the verse was accepted, a night began. But the most arousing part was not touch it, was anticipation, the slow unraveling of permission. In pottery, we see what texts hide. Red figure vases show scenes, a youth leaning into an elder, a woman reclining with another, three figures dancing in a spiral of limbs. These were not meant to shock, but to remind. Desire, like hunger, was a need. To Pi, it was not about explaining it, it was about accepting its presence. To make peace with it was to endure it. In dreams, the ancients believed, the divine communicated not through words, but through feeling. A brush of presence in a dream could shift the course of one's life. One woman shared that after such a dream, something changed within her so deeply, she could no longer return to her former way of sharing closeness. Not from absence of affection, but because something intangible had reshaped her. She chose solitude after that, planting lilies every spring, speaking softly to them as if they could understand. The flowers bloomed in colors unseen elsewhere. There were mentors who taught not by lecture, but by presence alone. A philosopher once said true learning only began when the student breathed in rhythm with the teacher. He sat close, listened carefully, and when the moment was right, he whispered insights that resonated more in the chest than in the ear. In the ancient stage, closeness was metaphor, a mask slowly removed, a pause between words. The chorus moved in patterns that echoed the human heartbeat. Crowds gathered under starlight, drawn not by the plot, but by a shared recognition that yearning begins not with touch, but with distance. In Crete, tradition described connection as a dansonot, one that aimed to unite, but to reflect. The dancers never made contact, yet by mirroring each other, they came to understand more than closeness could reveal. Those who watched felt moved not from sorrow, but from recognition. To understand this kind of bond in ancient Greece is to see it not as action, but as atmosphere. It lived in the olive groves, hummed in the strings of the lyre, shimmered in the passing of cups and the holding of silences. It was present in both celebration and ritual, in quiet gestures and subtle glances. It was not often named, but always felt. Even now, standing alone on a quiet shore at dusk, one might sense a rhythm from long ago, an ache not for someone, but for the moment before a connection began. Rest now. The body carries what the mind lets go, and in sleep, we return not to people, but to the echoes of nearness that once brushed against eternity. They said that to grasp this ancient bond, you had to start not with individuals, but with the city itself. The polis was more than stone and smoke. It breathed with memory and ambition. This unseen rhythm pulsed under conversations in the agora, whispered through temple prayers. To be a citizen was not just to vote or serve it, was to take part in the dance of visibility. Who was seen, who could connect, and under what light? In Athens, where democracy tangled itself like vines, this closeness was entangled with influence. The home was a private world. Women lived apart, shielded from the public eye, watched over, protected. Their lives of affection and duty followed a narrow path first, to fathers, then to husbands, then to the divine. Yet within those quiet walls, hidden stories bloomed, secret kindnesses, silent companionships, soft poems spoken in the dark. In those private moments, something unnamed was reclaimed. Thinkers of the time debated closeness like geometry, abstract and intense. One philosopher envisioned love between men as the purest kind, not because of the body, but because it could become dialogue between minds. To him, such connection was a ladder not toward desire, but toward truth. Others disagreed. They saw longing as too wild, too rooted in nature to fit within ideals. Still, even those who warned against its power were often drawn to its quiet glow. In gymnasiums, where sunlight touched skin and voices rose with challenge, connection lingered in gesture and laughter. Young men tested strength while elders guided them not only through speech but by example. This mentorship was seen as noble if boundaries remained. Affection could bloom, but gently. Curiosity could spark, but never burn. During great festivals, where masks lit by torches allowed for expression beyond daylight rules, communities entered shared celebration. Symbolic gestures were performed. Songs carried emotion, and the crowd became part of the story. These rituals, wild yet structured, allowed society to breathe out what had been held in. In that space, contact wasn't transgression, it was renewal. Yet even then, limits stood firm. Not all had the freedom to express. Those without status had no say over their closeness. Their stories, though rarely recorded, echo in the gaps left behind. To imagine connection in ancient Greece without remembering those silences is to read only half the text. Aiming for these silenced lives is to mistake myth for memory. The marital bed, meanwhile, was a place of contracts. Marriages were arranged, not for love, but for lineage, land, and alliance. A bride could be 12, a groom twice her age. Their first night might be watched or confirmed by witnesses. Some husbands approached their wives with caution, others with indifference. But occasionally, rarely, love grew awkward at first, like a seed planted in stone but persistent. Letters have survived in which husbands call their wives soul mirror, sleep companion, goddess of my threshold. These were not the norm, but they existed, fragile exceptions within a rigid frame. Outside the cities, in villages, and on islands, EX followed different laws. In Lesbos, women composed verses to each other that still burn. Sappho, whose name survives though her voice has been mangled by centuries of translation, wrote of EX not as conquest, but as melting. She did not separate longing from the sea breeze or the hush of leaves. For her, desire was environment. Her poems were not declarations, but invitations. And though much of her work is lost, her name became shorthand for a kind of love history tried to erase. Mystery cults told their own stories. In Eleusis, where initiates drank barley and chanted in darkness, EX was transformation. To be touched during ritual was to be reborn. The veil between this world and the next thinned, and in that liminal space, bodies became bridges. Men and women claimed afterward that they had seen Persephone's shadow and that her gaze had entered their skin like fire. The rites were secret, their details guarded by oaths, but fragments remain songs that refer to the soft hand in the underworld and the kiss that carries wheat. These phrases meant nothing to outsiders. To those who knelt in that earth, they meant everything. In the military camps, EX was both necessity and solace. Soldiers far from home created their own families of sweat and sword. They carved names into shields, not of their mothers but of comrades. In campfires' glow, they shared cloaks and bodies, spoke of death with open mouths. Some claim that to survive battle, one had to feel known by at least one other person completely. Not loved in a romantic sense, but held in full recognition. Such intimacy transcended roles, even survival. There are burial stones that bear two names, side by side, with no title between. The sculptors left space for interpretation, and in that space, love lived. The idea of EX as currency also emerged. Prostitutes, male and female, existed openly in cities like Corinth and Delos. Some were independent, wearing bright sashes, and painting their doors red. Others were owned, their earnings taken. Yet even among the exploited, power flickered. One woman, called Rodine, charged triple her peers. Men still came, not for her touch, but for her stories. She recited Homer mid-embrace, asked questions no one else dared. They left her with more than coins. She died with a library in her name. The laws tried to contain EX, to confine it within categories. But EX spilled across those lines, staining philosophy, war, art, prayer, rebellion. Mothers warned daughters, poets teased kings, youths tested elders. No one escaped its reach, though many pretended. Even the Stoics, who championed reason over passion, confessed in their journals to dreams that made their sheets damp and their logic unravel. They wrote in metaphors, ashamed, but still they wrote. In the architecture of Athens, EX reveals itself and angles the narrow doorway to a hidden courtyard, the sudden curve of a bench in the symposium hall, the shadowed corners where two could linger without name. Stone does not forget. It holds heat. It remembers bodies, leaning, fingers grasping, eyes asking. Even now, these walls whisper. At sea, sailors sang of sirens, not as threats, but as memories. They imagined islands where EX knew no law, where consent was symphonic, where shame did not dock. These islands never existed, except in longing. But longing, the ancients said, was the most real part of being. It carved paths through marble and sleep. In marketplaces, EX was haggled over in whispers, a glance exchanged across fig crates, a hand brushing fruit too softly. Vendors knew which customers stayed too long, which coins were warm from the palm. Behind stalls, in storerooms, stories unfolded that never made it into records, but echoed in lullabies and kitchen songs. Children grew from these moments. Their paternity sometimes guessed, sometimes ignored, always lived. And so, EX in ancient Greece was not a singular thing. It was ritual, resistance, routine. It was both political and personal, controlled and chaotic. It was performed in daylight and whispered in dusk. It was feared and worshipped, hidden and paraded. It lived in amphoras, in law scrolls, in battlefield poems, in temple dust. It shaped myth and made memory. And though centuries have passed, its rhythm still lingers beneath ancient marble and behind museum glass, not waiting to be decoded, but to be felt. Rest now. Let the reverberations lead you where speech cannot reach. Let this presence, in its most subtle and essential form, surround your thoughts not as historical record, but as breath itself. To understand the deeper undertone of ancient connection in Greece, one must look beyond whispers, in courtyards or vows, made in sacred halls. One must pause before the blank stares of statues, feel the hush within vessels sealed behind museum glass. The Greeks explored human nature not just through the physical, but through gesture, stance, portrayal, and deliberate absence. It was in what was shown and what was withheld that meaning unfolded. Artists of the classical age were not merely craftsmen. They were builders of myth. Every arc of marble, every fine line of bronze, echoed memory deeper than linear time. A decorated calyxus during symposia offered more than wine. It extended a frozen moment, a reclining figure, a stringed instrument, the trace of laughter suspended in paint. Stillness held stories where words might falter. The Greeks did not avoid exploring closeness. They just layered it. A figure turned a citadel in retreat, but an expression. A divine encounter told through symbol, not clarity. A wild creature pursuing a maidenhair glanced back, unreadable but potent. These myths whispered, "This story lives between us, not merely in front of you." Temple reliefs did not merely decorate, they structured meaning. Dionysus surrounded by robed followers in a spiral of reverie. Aphrodite rising not through lineage, but through a transformation of longing. In her gaze, not sentiment, but command. What the Greeks described wasn't merely a force, it was a realm, a territory of ritual and significance. Even the most powerful figures, like Heracles, were portrayed with striking contrast: strength paired with tenderness. The message was clear: power and vulnerability walk hand in hand. Greek culture revered harmony. It distrusted imbalance. So their portrayals of connection emphasized anticipation, not finality. The moment before the nearness. The breath before the gesture. That was where their truth dwelled. In poetry, the tone shifted again. Homer evoked bonds through layered metaphor. When Odysseus returned, it was not only to reclaim his household, it was to rethread the connections once pulled thin by war and longing. Their bed, carved from a living tree, stood not just as furniture, but as vow. In Hesiod's writings, closeness was both test and offering. Pandora herself was more than creation, she was a symbol, a question, an unfolding riddle. Her presence marked a turning. She was origin and warning alike, and always Sappho. Her fragmented verses still stir the imagination, precisely because they resist closure. She wrote not of events, but of feelings. The soft quake of emotion, a warmth carried in pain, sweetness wrapped in ache. She wasn't interested in triumphant, in the very nature of wanting, and that wanting has outlived even her ink. The philosophers sought to shape this force into something explainable. Socrates believed the highest form of connection was of understanding, where true knowing was the sacred bond. And yet even he was accused of stirring too much with his ideas, suggesting knowledge could be magnetic and maybe should be. Spiritual paths embrace this ambiguity. The Eleusinian rites, the secretive circles of Orpheus and Cybele. In those spaces, transformation occurred. Some participants renounced aspects of themselves, not to reject life, but to reach beyond it. Their transitions were not about denial, but about transcendence. And in the hush of night, it was said that dreams returned not with fear, but with unfamiliar images. Statues whispered, vines brushed shoulders, presences circled firelight. These were not predictions, but recognitions. Beyond pottery and sculpture, adornments told quiet tales. Rings carved with dolphin, serpent, or owl passed between hands, each creature bearing meaning. The dolphin, joy and journey. The serpent, renewal. The owl, memory and clarity. Some wore bracelets inscribed with lines from poems hidden under fabric, not for display, but remembrance. The essence of closeness in their world was never ownership, it was honoring, remembering. The stage was a mirror. Costumes exaggerated form, masks amplified voice. The ancient theaters were not only arenas for stories, but places where the human experience was held to light. Aristophanes teased the line between laughter and truth. In one play, he imagined a world where change could come through absence, not force. The crowd laughed, but not only because it was funny, because it was possible. Absurd, but because it felt alarmingly possible. The very power structure of Greece had to pretend that EX was secondary, when in truth, it held empires together and broke them apart. Gods themselves were not immune. Zeus's liaisons alone could fill libraries, every one of his children, a monument to boundary-breaking Hera's wrath, equally a testament to the emotional architecture of betrayal and desire. Mortals imitated gods. In this, as in all things, sometimes EX was used as a tool of manipulation. Alcibiades, the notorious Athenian general and statesman, was rumored to seduce for strategy. His beauty, as much a weapon as his sword. He entered Sparta with charm, in Athens with cunning, his EX life. More infamous than his battles, yet to remember him only for that would be to miss the Greek nuance for them. EX was not only who you touched, but why, how, with what consequence, what philosophy, what intention. Children were taught not just moral lessons, but stories that carried layered warnings and permissions. When told the tale of Apollo and Hyacinthus, They saw God's love for a youth ending in blood, but also in rebirth. The flower that sprang from his wound was said to carry letters of grief on its petals. Love creates beauty. Love destroys love. Lives on the aftertaste of EX. In ancient Greece also lived in silences, in the parts of scrolls burned by time, in the unsent letters buried with the dead, in the unnamed faces, sarcophagi, in the breathless space between ancient lines of verse where a word has crumbled and meaning must be guessed. It lived in the sigh of a scribe recording a story he dared not claim in his own name. It lived in the statues whose eyes had once been painted with color, now white and blind, but still reaching across centuries. And perhaps most clearly it lived in the ritual of storytelling itself, as Greeks gathered under moonlight and torches passed wineskin to palm. They told each other stories about gods and mortals, about punishments and passions, and in the retelling they touched something invisible and binding a shared understanding that EX was not just an act but an alphabet, a way of spelling the unspellable. So as you drift now into sleep, let that alphabet write itself into your mind, not as noise, but as hum, not as history, but as echo. The past has no voice, only resonance, and if you listen quietly enough, you might feel it not as words but as warmth between your ribs, behind your eyes, beneath your skin. Sleep. Now let marble and myth cradle you into the hush of 1,000 ancient sighs, in the dry hush of the Athenian dawn, before the bustle of sandals against stone and the rise of the agora's voices in debate. The city exhaled memories, etched not in records, but in gestures among the columns and porticos. EX was not hidden, nor fully exposed. It was woven into the structure of the polis in Athens. EX was political, pedagogical, and poetic. All at once, a boy entering adolescence was not left to stumble through passion alone. He was guided, watched, not with suspicion, but with a mix of reverence, and control. The system of pederasty, so controversial to the modern mind, was to the Greeks a mentorship, an education, a ritual of status and emotion. The older lover called the Orestes, and the younger beloved the Eromenos, formed a relationship thought to prepare the youth for adulthood. The elder would offer gifts, protection, poetry training, while the younger offered admiration, attention, and a kind of blooming affection, but rules bounded these interactions to prevent exploitation. The court records that survive, though rare, suggest a concern with dignity, mutuality, and honor. The public eye watched closely, less out of morality and more out of civic order. Too much indulgence would shame the Erastes, too little would shame the Eromenos. Restraint was admired as much as skill. Socrates was a figure suspended in this tension. His dialogues, preserved by Plato, are filled with layered references to love, beauty, and desire. But the philosopher often turned EX into metaphor, speaking of climbing the ladder from physical attraction to the love of the soul. Diotima's speech in the Symposium outlines this journey, where the love of one body expands to all bodies, to the beauty of minds, to the beauty of laws, and finally to the form of beauty itself, an abstract perfection, untouched by flesh and yet ignited by it. But if Athens intellectualized EX, Sparta weaponized it in the Dorian city-state, where boys were taken from their families at 7 and placed into military barracks. EX was a method of bonding, forging loyalty and unity among soldiers. Historians argue that romantic and sometimes erotic relationships were encouraged between pairs to increase discipline, cohesion. The lover would protect his beloved fiercely in battle, not just as a comrade, but as something more sacred. In Sparta, the female role in EX was equally striking. Women were trained in athletics, raced nude in festivals, and were expected to be strong vocal and assertive. EX in marriage was not about submission, but brie. Spartan traditions offered a notable contrast to much of the Greek world. In this society, women were allowed to own land and often entered marriage later in life than men. These customs introduced a different kind of balance within the household, one marked by mutual responsibility and a distinct rhythm of daily living. While emotional life was rarely discussed openly, small signs of care and loyalty remained deeply rooted in practice. Elsewhere, Thebes offered a unique example through its renowned sacred band, a military formation of exceptional discipline and commitment. These pairs were chosen not just for tactical skill, but for the strength of their trust. The guiding belief was simple: those who stand side by side in purpose form a stronger defense. Though they eventually fell in battle, the memory of their dedication became part of the broader cultural legacy. Delphi, long considered the spiritual center of Greece, held rituals rich with meaning. The priestesses of Apollo were devoted to quiet, disciplined prayer, contemplation, and symbolic observances. Some believed their visions reflected deeper truths, emerging not from the world around them, but from within. The goal of these practices was not display, but elevation, a movement of the self towards something greater. The Greek term ecstasis referred to stepping beyond one's ordinary self, and this described many of the sacred traditions in places like Delphi or Eleusis. Participants engaged in ceremonies designed to reflect larger cycles: light and shadow, harvest and return, pause and renewal. Each act carried a deeper symbolism, never explained, but always present in gesture and memory. In the homes and communities of Greece, relationships looked different depending on where one lived. Agreements were often formed through contracts, yet human lives rarely followed paper. Some writings describe how people arranged their households with separate spaces for routine, joy, and learning. This division was not seen as strange, it was practical, accepted, and common. Women, especially those of officials standing off, and lived within certain boundaries, their lives recorded briefly in surviving texts. Yet in preserved artworks, moments of daily presence appear. Faces turned toward each other, quiet companionship, shared space. These scenes do not speak loudly, but they remain. Some individuals stepped beyond expected roles. One of the most well-known examples was Aspasia, whose sharp mind and engaging speech made her a key figure in the intellectual circles of Athens. She participated in public life in ways few women did, and her influence left a strong impression on both history and politics. At private gatherings, known as symposiums, guests reclined and exchanged stories, music, and questions. Performers from other regions were often invited to add artistry to the occasion. While the atmosphere was relaxed, these moments shaped ideas and conversations that lasted long after the final song. Even ordinary habits were filled with expression. People took great care in appearance, and not for vanity, but to reflect dignity and attentiveness. In gymnasiums, physical training emphasized discipline and balance. These spaces helped form more than bodies, they shaped ideals. At festivals, observers watched with quiet interest as symbols passed through the streets, representing nature, growth, and renewal. Inside the home, private items sometimes told their own stories. Scrolls bearing lines of poetry rested near windows. Pottery depicted moments of companionship. Myths of the gods often reflected everyday challenges, decisions, conflicts, attempts to find understanding. Their stories reminded mortals that even among the stars, no one was immune to uncertainty. Customs differed across regions. Some cities placed strict limits on public expression. Others allowed more variety. But throughout the Greek world, shared traditions helped communities stay connected through rhythm, memory, and meaning that echoed far beyond any single voice. Sang of desire, and in wrestling schools, They grappled bodies slick with oil, not always with innocence, but rarely with shame. Their teachers taught not just technique, but boundaries. And in that balance, EX found its place, neither elevated nor suppressed, simply present. Accepted the modern desire to divide EX from life, to isolate it in rooms and rules would have confused the Greeks to them. It was a thread running through governance, art worship, warfare, birth death, every moment touched by its hue. Some resisted, some indulged, some shaped entire philosophies around it. And in that diversity of thought and practice, Greece found not contradiction, but wholeness. A civilization built not on repression, but on reflection. And if you listen closely, the echoes still remain in ruins that blush in sunset, in broken statues whose curves remain tender in the hush of theater masks with open mouths, waiting to speak again, of longing, of loss of EX, that lives even now beneath marble and moonlight. They gathered in shaded courtyards where the scent of figs mixed with sun-warmed stone and whispered their thoughts, not in loud declarations, but in fragmented laughter, in glances, in rituals, too subtle for outsiders to decode. This was the language of EX outside the temples, and beyond the law. EX lived in the quiet details of daily life, in the way a woman brushed oil into her hair before the hearth, or how two men lingered, heartbeat longer at the well than necessity demanded in homes, with walls of clay and rooms split by thin curtains. EX was choreographed between duty and desire, sometimes as tension, sometimes as release. The loom creaked as women wove patterns into cloth, and beneath their hands the warp and weft concealed dreams of other bodies, other touches, in symposiums where women were rarely invited. The conversations about EX were not always explicit, but neither were they. Innocent philosophers like Xenophon and Antisthenes debated the value of friendship and virtue. And often these debates glided close to the edge of desire. For Greeks, the line between philia, eros, and agape was porous, overlapping. Love of friend, love of body, love of soul could all live within one look, one word, one shared silence. In the theater of Dionysus, actors wore masks that exaggerated joy and sorrow, and the stories played out on stage were filled with EX, though often veiled in metaphor. Euripides' tragedies especially hinted at forbidden desires, the unnatural hungers, the lusts of gods and mortals and monsters alike. In Hippolytus, the title character rejects the goddess Aphrodite and worships chaste Artemis. But this rejection leads not to peace, but ruin. The message, woven through the 10 chorus, is simple. You cannot banish what lies in your blood. Even denial is a kind of obsession, and thus a kind of EX. In the art of vase painting, entire worlds of EX unfolded, black figure and red figure styles, immortalized bodies, in every pose of passion and play, not merely for titillation, but for storytelling. Warriors embracing before battle, lovers reclining beneath grapevines, gods seducing mortals, mortals deceiving gods. The most common depictions were not of conquest, but of invitation, mutuality, humor, vulnerability, a hand reaching not to possess, but to ask. Are you with me? Do you feel it too? The anonymity of the figures rendered them universal. The viewer could see himself or herself within the scene, and in doing so find permission to feel too. In the alleys of Athens, in the upper chambers of taverns where wine flowed less formally, EX unfolded in more chaotic rhythms. Prostitutes, male and female, foreign and local, offered their bodies for coin or shelter or bread, while some worked in organized brothels, Others stood by doorways wrapped in thin hamations, calling out in practiced tones. There was little shame in this profession, though. It carried social stigma. The goddess of love, Aphrodite herself, was sometimes honored as Aphrodite porn, the protector of sex workers. Temples to her stood near the harbors, where sailors paid homage with coins and flowers and prayers for safe passage. These dual aspects of Aphrodite, celestial and carnal, reflected how Greeks understood EX as multifaceted, capable of uplifting or consuming in private households. Even slaves were entangled in EX, their consent often irrelevant, their bodies controlled by their masters and mistresses, yet some formed secret bonds with each other, bonds that flickered with tenderness in a world that denied them names. Such stories seldom made it into official histories, but they live in fragments, in notes, in poems, in the careful repairs made to shattered pottery, depicting two figures standing too close in the marketplace. The erotics of power were ever present between teacher and student, between general and soldier, between citizen and foreigner. Each relationship wrapped in layers of dominance, affection, dependence, and revolt. And what of women, together rarely acknowledged in texts yet visible in subtext? The poet Sappho of Lesbos wrote verses to her female companion, S, full of longing and lyricism. Her island became synonymous with love between women, though her legacy was distorted by centuries of misinterpretation and censorship. Her words survive as glimpses. Fire runs under my skin. My heart races when I see her, the simplicity of her emotion, unadorned by theory or philosophy, reminds us that EX did not require permission to exist. It found crevices between rules and rituals, blooming in laughter shared at the laundry stone, in the clandestine meetings, at the thesmophoria where women gathered without men and enacted rituals too sacred for male eyes. During these festivals, women invoked Demeter and Persephone, and some scholars believe EX may have formed part of their secret rites, not in spectacle but in solidarity, a way to affirm life, even as they mourned loss. In the countryside, shepherds sang of nymphs and dryads, of liaisons beneath moonlight beside streams. Tales passed from fire to fire, hinting at unions not just with humans, but with the natural world itself. EX became a bridge to what was wild and unknowable. Centaurs pursued, maidens, satyrs danced erect and howling through Dionysian rites, blurring lines between joy and frenzy, pain and ecstasy. In mystery, cults like those of Orpheus and Dionysus, EX was a path to transcendence. The Bacchantes roamed mountains clad in ivy, tearing apart goats in trance-like states. Their rapture was sacred, their nakedness symbolic not of shame, but freedom from the civil order. In such moments, EX was not merely physical, but elemental, a tearing open of the self to let the divine rush in the body, not as barrier, but as vessel. Philosophers tried to contain these forces, some succeeding momentarily. The Stoics, for instance, sought to subordinate EX to reason, to treat desire as a disturbance, to be quieted. But even they acknowledged that EX was a part of nature and must be handled, not eradicated. The Epicureans were more accepting, seeing pleasure, including sensual pleasure, as a component of the good life. Though moderation was key, even the great Plato, who so often sublimated desire into metaphysics, could not resist weaving erotic longing into his dialogues. His love for Socrates was not just intellectual, it pulsed with admiration, yearning, and mystery. Aristophanes in the Symposium tells a myth that once humans were whole with 2 faces and 4 arms, until Zeus split them, and ever since we wander seeking our other half. EX, in this telling, is the ache for return, the hunger to be one again, not merely in flesh, But in being in Athens, certain women known as Palaki concubines lived with men in unofficial unions. Some were former slaves, others foreigners. They bore children, ran households, and occasionally wielded influence without legal marriage. Their position was precarious, yet their presence acknowledged. Similarly, male lovers could live together under social scrutiny, but not always condemnation. The flexibility of practice often belied the rigidity of law, and in that space between private truth and public performance, EX lived its richest life. When disaster struck, earthquakes, famines, invasions, EX did not vanish. It mutated. Widows and widowers sought comfort in arms, not sanctioned by priests. Survivors clung to bodies as proof that they still existed. That warmth still flowed, even as the world cracked apart in funerary reliefs. The dead are often depicted touching the living hands, barely brushing a shoulder, a gaze held too long. These images tell of loss, yes, but also of EX, as memory, as promise, as continuity. In the afterlife, playwrights imagined Hades not as cold, but as strangely fertile, filled with reunions, whispers, kisses stolen before fading into shadow. And in some mystery traditions, the union of Persephone and Hades was seen not as abduction, but as sacred marriage, misunderstood by mortals, but divinely ordained, a reminder that even in darkness, EX had a role to play in healing, in bridging the seen and unseen in dreams. EX was unbound, unshaped by law or logic. Figures appeared as hybrids of known and unknown, sometimes with faces of past lovers, sometimes with voices of gods. Dream interpreters warned that such visions could be omens or echoes of repressed needs. And still the dreams came silent, witnesses to the secret terrains the mind traveled, while the body slept. Even children were not untouched by the discourse of EX, though rarely acted upon. Their awareness was shaped by the stories they heard, the images they saw, the roles they were assigned. As boys watched older men joke or posture, as girls helped their mothers prepare for guests, they absorbed a code unwritten but potent, and thus EX passed on not just through act but through air and gaze and gesture and time. Statues replaced bodies, myths replaced memories, but the essence remained: the need to reach, to touch, to be seen, and in that reaching to become something more than one, more than now, more than mortal. In the hush of temple sanctuaries and the smoky corners of homes, EX endured as ritual as silence, as breath held between duties. Not Eve. Everything about it needed to be spoken. The Greeks knew this instinctively, and where words failed, they let gesture take over, a hand lingering on a shoulder, the way a chiton slipped from the collarbone, the pulse of bare feet against warm flagstones. Some acts of EX were not meant for the public eye, nor even for remembrance, and yet the air remembered it. The grain of the wood, the wear of the stone in Delphi, where oracles spoke in riddles. The priestess of Apollo sat on the omphalos stone, her utterances trembling with ambiguity. Some believe that her trances mirrored ecstatic states, and the gods' communion with her was as much EX as prophecy. This EX wasn't one of flesh, but of merging, surrendering the self to something larger, be it divinity or vision. The same logic applied in Eleusis during the mysteries where initiates passed through symbolic death and rebirth, enveloped by darkness, fasting, and secret signs. Some whispered of sacred unions acted out or imagined between Persephone and the underworld. The ritualistic merging of realms above and below these initiations hinted at a truth. The Greeks held close: EX could be transformation, not just gratification. It was feared because it disrupted structure, its potential to reorder identities, to erode boundaries, to birth ecstasy or ruin, was always present. And so society contained it with marriage, with law, with theater. Yet in its shadows, something older stirred in older myths. Before Homer, before the Olympians, before linear B tablets, recorded names, the Great Mother reigned, a figure of fertility and hunger and cycles. Her lovers were many, mortal and divine, and often they were sacrificed after union. EX was a key to power, to prophecy, to death. Such echoes remained in rituals like those of Adonis, celebrated by women who mourned his death, in garden shrines, placing seeds on shallow trays that sprouted and withered, in days a symbol of passions, brevity, of the cost of desire. Even children's games held traces of EX, the passing of tokens under tunics, the songs with double meanings, the way eyes darted to see who watched. Their growing bodies were taught to fear and to beckon simultaneously. Their curiosity met with warnings, their questions deflected or twisted. Yet the body remembered always the teachings of touch and warmth, the whisper of skin against linen, laughter that trembled at the edge of something more and legal. In terms, Athens treated EX with a sharp divide. Citizens were expected to marry and produce heirs, but extramarital affairs were tolerated for men, especially with slaves and concubines. However, any citizen woman found in adultery could be divorced, exiled, or even killed. The law was not symmetrical, nor was it meant to be. It preserved property inheritance, order beneath this structure. Desire found crooked corridors to slip through. Male citizens might form lifelong bonds with their male lovers, writing poems to each other, competing in the gymnasium, flexing both intellect and sinew at once. In Sparta, such bonds were encouraged among warriors, believed to deepen loyalty in battle. A man would not flee if his beloved stood beside him, nor would he shame himself by weakness. The erotic and the martial wove together, forming a braid of sweat, dust, and discipline. The Spartan woman too differed from her. Athenian sister, given more freedom, she exercised, publicly spoke boldly, and sometimes chose her lovers without apology. Plutarch recounts tales of shared husbands of women who stole kisses at festivals, of Spartan queens who ruled as much with presence as with bloodline. These women embodied a different face of EX, not demure, not hidden, but honed. As weapon and wisdom in literature, the Greeks were unafraid to explore EX's darker hues. The Bacchae of Euripides showed how suppression could erupt into frenzy. The women driven mad, tearing apart those who opposed them. Dionysus, watching with divine detachment, teaching that what is denied becomes monstrous. In Ovid, though Roman, he draws upon Greek tradition to recount tales of nymphs, pursued gods, disguised as animals, or showers of gold mortals, transformed as punishment or reward. EX and metamorphosis intertwined inescapably. The lesson laced in every myth: beware the God who desires you, for you will not remain yourself. Some myths did not punish love, but made it eternal in stone or stars. The tale of Endymion, sleeping forever beneath the moon, who loved him each night, her touch never waking him yet, never ceasing. Others spoke of love that broke curses, like Alcestis, returning from Hades for her husband, or Orpheus, descending to rescue Eurydice. Though failing, each of these stories held EX not only as act, but as promise, as desperation as gamble. In rural shrines, offerings to Pan included goat meat, wine, and laughter. His followers danced naked among trees, playing flutes, wild and irreverent. They knew EX as laughter, as mischief, as sweat-soaked joy, untouched by law or shame. Nearby satyrs chased nymphs, their lust cartoonish yet symbolic, reminding humans of their animal sea. And that desire untamed could be frightening, but also liberating in private rooms, painted with frescoes of Eros, winged and smirking young couples sought to mimic the gods each touch, rehearsed each breath, a step in choreography passed, down through whispers from older sisters, from kitchen maids, from shepherd boys, from sailors. Their techniques inherited like recipes adjusted, refined, made sacred by intimacy. EX in this form was not about mastery, but presence, a mutual, witnessing a quiet revelation of the self, of scars and hopes and softness, not shown elsewhere. When tragedy struck families, often clung tighter physically, not always sexually, but through touch, through shared beds, shared grief. Parents would hold grown, sons, wives would cradle dying, husbands not for pleasure but for anchoring. The skin became a shoreline against drowning. Entire generations processed war, famine, plague through the language of bodies huddled together, wrapped in woven wool and silence. Poets immortalized EX, not in grand declarations but in details, a gaze half turned, a wrist tense before release, lovely step, and the motion of light on her face, then chariots of Lydians or ranks of foot soldiers. This was EX. In observation, in longing, not possession, in the reverence of form, in the ache of distance. Her fragments, though scarce, burn with clarity, showing how desire survives erasure even, half remembered. It pulses stronger than doctrine in old age. EX did not vanish. It softened, slowed, but still sang. Old men joked of lost virility, women of fading beauty, but beneath the jests was mourning, and memory the body craved, even if weakened. It remembered pleasure, like a song half heard on wind. Some said the soul retained its desires beyond death, seeking reunion in fields of asphodel, where lovers walked hand in hand without shame or consequence. The dead made no laws, only longing. And if the underworld was real, then so too was its hunger for EX, not as indulgence, but as echo, as thread binding. The living to the gone in temples, abandoned and worn, the gods remain silent. Their statues chipped, their altars bare. But if one listens, the wind speaks still of hands brushing in moonlight, of laughter, in olive groves, of names whispered beneath stars. The Greeks did not ask whether EX was moral, only whether it was fitting, balanced, timely. They feared its extremes, but honored its presence. It was a gift of the gods, and a danger of mortals. A mystery best not fully understood, lest it lose its power. And so it was painted, sung, whispered, lived, and buried. And still it rises in dreams, in stories, in the hush of sleep, where all rules fall away, and touch becomes truth again. When night fell over ancient Greece, the shadows did not retreat. They stretched long and silent over marble courtyards and olive groves. And the people who lived beneath them knew the dark was not merely absence of light, but a domain of its own, where rules shifted and truths emerged from silence. EX did not sleep at dusk. It stirred in temples, in private chambers, in dreams, and the worship of figures like Hecate revealed just how much the Greeks feared and revered the nocturnal side of desire. Hecate, goddess of boundaries, of magic, of crossroads, was often invoked at liminal times, her torches lighting the path between known and unknown. Her presence was sought when the boundaries of the body blurred, during rites of transformation and during acts of EX that defied norm or tradition. In Thessaly, it was whispered that witches called upon her during rites under moonless skies to mix herbs, chant, and shed garments not for seduction but for communion spells. Involving EX were not rare in Greece. Some crafted filters to spark affection, Others to bind the will of a beloved sympathetic magic included piercing, wax dolls laying offerings, burying items soaked in bodily fluids beneath thresholds. Thresholds being sacred spaces of crossing, where spirits and desire both lingered. These acts were not merely manipulation, but a desperate grasp at control. In a world where EX could unravel lives, men who feared losing their wives would consult seers or try incantations. Women suspicious of their husbands might seek oracles or perform rituals, asking the gods to restore harmony or punish betrayal. Fear of betrayal, fear of obsession, fear of losing oneself to another's desire or to one's own, were all woven into these acts. Desire was powerful, yes, but it was also dangerous, and the Greeks knew its most potent forms rarely wore garlands or perfumes. Sometimes it came with teeth, with madness, with possession. Madness was not merely illness in Greek thought, but a visitation, a god's grip on the mind. EX-related mania, especially associated with Dionysus, was a terrifying, yet sacred, state. The Maenads, his followers, danced in frenzied ecstasy, tearing through forests, chanting with abandon. Often, in the nude, their frenzy was not erotic, in a modern sense, but deeply bodily. Their cries pierced the night. Their feet bled on rocky slopes. Their eyes, hauled skyward. They became conduits of wild, unfiltered energy. And while to outsiders they looked mad to themselves, they were free, unshackled from reason, from shame, from the crushing order of polis and household. And though rare, some women joined them not for rebellion, but for release from marriages, from silences, from identities forced upon them. And in their screams, they found themselves again, or were lost forever. EX was rarely cleanly defined in this world. It existed between layers, and in the cities too. Its specter crept not only in alleys or brothels, but within homes, the proximity of slaves and masters, of tutors and pupils, of hosts and guests, created tension unseen, yet palpable. In wealthier homes, rooms were built for symposia, gatherings of elite men to drink, debate, recline on couches, as music played and food was passed, and in these rooms courtesans or hetairai moved with practiced grace, offering not only flesh, but wit, trained in philosophy, music, poetry. Their role was unique, both marginalized and elevated. And EX here was exchange of more than bodies. It was ideas, intimacy, performance. Yet, even in these privileged encounters, there lingered imbalance, vulnerability in every glance. If a hetero was loved, she might be abandoned. If too clever, she might be feared. If too passive, dismissed men. Meanwhile, negotiated their masculinity through conquest. Not only in war, but in love, to be desired was acceptable, but to be consumed was weakness. And some philosophers warned against overindulgence, warning that too much EX drained vital essence, that semen was a form of spirit that once spent left men weakened. Pythagoreans avoided sex on certain days, believed in retention of bodily energies as spiritual discipline. Plato took a different stance in his later works, imagining love as a ladder one climbed from bodily desire to intellectual and divine love, with EX being the first rung, not to be condemned, but transcended. And yet even he acknowledged how the physical could stir the soul more deeply than reason. Sometimes, could art echo this duality in pottery? One might find explicit scenes of intercourse next to depictions of heroic battle, suggesting to the viewer that courage and desire shared common ground. that Conquest and EX mirrored each other. The same painter who drew a hoplite lunging forward with spear also drew a man lifting his lover's kite and eyes locked. Across history, and perhaps both, were acts of risk, of exposure, and in both, the outcome was never certain. In the realm of dreams, EX took yet another shape. Greeks believed dreams carried messages from gods or spirits. Sometimes the dreamer saw themselves embraced by deities or strange figures. Sometimes animal symbols of fertility or fear. Sometimes they awoke, shivering or aroused, or both. Artemidorus, a dream interpreter from the 2nd century, collected such dreams, categorizing them, noting which portended success, which warned of shame, which revealed repressed longing. He knew what the people themselves knew, that EX did not end at the bedroom. It threaded through the unconscious, where rules of law and polis held no dominion, in rural areas, where deities like Pan and nymphs held sway. EX took on rustic forms. Rituals involved music, dance, wine, and nudity, not in mockery, but as return to primal. Connection offerings left at trees or streams were tokens of gratitude or longing. Some swore they'd seen fawns watching from the brush, that after certain dances in groves, their bodies felt touched even when alone. And while such stories seemed fanciful, they reflected a deeper truth, that desire could be both hallucination and revelation. Ancient calendars marked festivals tied to fertility: Demeter's Thesmophoria, Artemis's Brauronia, Dionysian revels. And during these times, behaviors shifted boundaries. Loosened songs were bawdier. Masks allowed anonymity. Participants cried out to gods to make their fields fertile, their bodies fruitful, their homes secure. And these cries were not metaphor, but invocation. A call from flesh to divine, asking not for miracles but for continuity in sickness. EX2 appeared. The ill were sometimes soothed by touch, by closeness. Physicians debated whether certain ailments stemmed from sexual repression, especially among women, with wandering wombs being a diagnosis, traced to imbalance of humors and lack of fulfillment. Midwives served not only in childbirth but in guiding bodies toward comfort when physicians refused, and such guidance might include herbs, baths, or instruction whispered behind drawn curtains. And the house would hush, and the woman might weep, not from shame, but from relief of being seen as whole, not broken, of being treated as someone with a body, not a burden. Philosophers argued endlessly about virtue, and vice poets knew that desire did not wait for theory. It arrived, unbidden, in spring winds, in music, in sorrow, and it lingered long after its object had vanished, sometimes longer than love itself. And that is why, even in tragedy, plays like Hippolytus by Euripides, the danger of Désir looms larger than swords. Phaedra's longing for her stepson is not rational. It is not chosen yet. It is real and fatal. And in her ruin, the audience sees not a warning, but a mirror of what happens when EX and silence collide, leaving behind only echoes. And if one were to walk the ruins of those cities now, to press a palm against stone walls, worn by centuries, one might still feel it. The warmth of bodies, the laughter, the sigh, the betrayal, the reverence not recorded in text, but in touch, in space, in the places where light fails and memory clings. The Greeks did not need to define EX. Precisely they lived it, feared it, honored it, transformed by it. And in the rituals of darkness, they found a truth brighter than daylight, that EX was not deviation but rhythm, the breath between words, the pause before song, the tremor in the voice that said, I am here, I am human, I desire. And that is enough. In the sculpted folds of marble, where eyes could not blink, and lips could never part. There still lingered the trace of EX, a curve of hip, a hint of thigh, a glance, frozen in time, that invited the viewer not merely to admire, but to feel. And in ancient Greece, sculpture was not simply representation. It was embodiment. The divine and the human collided in forms that transcended shame. Gods stood nude warriors too, and their bareness was not vulnerability, but declaration of power. Men were idealized with muscles, taught in motion or repose. The stone itself seemed to breathe some figures, caught mid-stride, others relaxed, yet alert, each line a hymn to symmetry. And within this perfection, there was desire, not always overt, not always direct, but present, like a song just beneath hearing. And viewers, especially in temples or gardens, approached these statues with a mix of reverence and longing. Some whispered prayers. Others reached out when no one looked, touching cool stone that once imagined warm. EX was not absent in art. It was its echo. And in poetry, it became voice. Poets like Sappho spoke from Lesbos, her verses delicate and piercing. She wrote, not of conquest, but of longing, of the tremble before a kiss, of the ache when a lover departed. Her fragments survive, incomplete, like interrupted dreams, yet within them, emotion pulses clear. She does not plead. She sings, and the listener knows. She has touched love in its quietest moments. And when she speaks of women, she does so without apology. Her words are soft fire, and even centuries later, their warmth remains. Male poets, too, wrote of beauty and passion. Anacreon spoke of boys and girls, of wine and stolen glances, of the games. Desire plays, and these poems were not hidden. They were recited at banquets, inscribed in public places, not always with solemnity, often with laughter, but never with complete detachment, because everyone who heard them knew desire was not foreign. It lived among them in every touch, every silence. Even children learned of God's affairs, Zeus's transformations, his many pursuits. They heard of Leda, of Europa, of Ganymede. And while adults might see myth, children saw power and mystery, and grew into those myths, shaping their own stories around them. And those stories were not always joyful. Some told of punishment when desire broke. Hoarder Hippolytus scorned Aphrodite and was destroyed. Phaedra burned with forbidden want and perished, her shame spilling into the soil. And when priests told these tales, they did so not merely to caution, but to frame human frailty, as cosmic balanced desire could not be erased, only understood or endured. Temples bore witness not only to prayer but to petition, to offerings left in hope of fertility or harmony. Clay figurines small, phyloi garlands soaked in oil, placed at altars or trees. Gods were invoked to ease tension, to bring pleasure, to restore what illness or betrayal had taken. And in private rooms, husbands and wives lit lamps arranged, cushions prepared for union, not as duty alone, but sometimes with trembling hearts, laughter or regret or tenderness. And when the act passed, there might be silence or speech or sleep. And in the quiet, the gods did not look away. They remained watching, not to judge, but to remember. In rural areas, EX took root in simpler forms, dances at harvests, with bodies circling under stars, hands held until palms grew slick, eyes finding each other through veils of sweat and torchlight. No hymns, only rhythm, feet pounding earth, a call to life. And in these places, love was not always spoken. It was shown in gestures and shared bread, in gifts of fruit or crafted tokens, a carved ring, a dyed cloth, and when two chose each other, they might slip away too, riverbanks or groves, and there in rustle of reeds, find a space where EX was not law or sin, but pulse of being. Some unions were brief, others endured, and sometimes a child came, and with it, the gods were thanked again. EX was not separate from life. It flowed through it, shaped it, and even in death, its mark remained. Gravestones, or inscriptions of spouses, parted lovers, lost some with verses, some with only names and carved hands, joined forever. And in these images, memory held desire not as threat, but as legacy. The philosophers could debate its worth. The priests could prescribe its course. But the people lived it each in their way, each with fear, hope, and flame. And even those who swore off it, who cloaked themselves in celibacy or ritual fasts, felt its shadow in dreams, or glances, or sudden longing. When a stranger passed and they would pray, or run, or write poems, they never read aloud. And the tension would remain unresolved. EX was not chaos. It was hunger, for closeness, for touch, for being seen. It was the pause in music, the breath before a story, the silence after laughter. And it came dressed in many forms, sometimes soft, sometimes sudden, but always human. And to be Greek was to know this too, accept it. Not always peacefully, but truthfully. And so even as wars raged and empires rose and temples crumbled, people still reached for each other, still whispered in the dark, still dreamed of hands and lips and voices. And in that eternal reaching, EX found its home not only in act, but in yearning that never ceased. Even in sleep, the ancient Greeks carried EX with them into the quiet folds of dreams, where gods appeared not with thunder or fire, but with touch, with whisper, with presence that hovered at the edge of understanding. And it was said that dreams were the domain of Hypnos and his brother Thanatos. Sleep and death, twinned guardians of the threshold. And there within that darkness, EX took shape strange and familiar. A lost lover, appearing at the foot of a bed, a fleeting kiss from someone never met, the weight of bodies, entwined with no memory of how they arrived, and no fear of waking. And priests paid attention to these dreams, for they held omens, stories, warnings. Sometimes they spoke of harvest or war, but often they spoke of longing, a woman dreaming of her, betrothed, a man dreaming of one long gone. And when these visions came, they were not dismissed, but offered to the temples, placed in words and symbols on papyrus, burned with herbs, or sung softly to the moon in hopes of peace. For EX did not end with daylight, nor with age in the homes of the old EX, was not absent, merely changed a hand resting on another's knee, a glance exchanged, while grinding barley stories, murmured of past passions of wild spring nights of youths, who had since become myths. And among the aged, there was no shame in memory. They wore it like a warm cloak against the cold. And in the symposiums where men gathered to drink, debate, even the elder ones laughed and told of past pursuits of loves, lost and won, and no one sneered for age, was not decay, but depth, and the appetite of the soul was never ridiculed in the poetry of experience. The body might tire, but the heart could still stir, and EX was no less potent for it, in temples to Asclepios, where the sick sought healing. Inscriptions remain not only of pain, but of desire of those who prayed for strength to love again, to be touched, to be seen, not as broken but whole. And in some rare moments healing came, and they left tokens, small sculptures of limbs, of eyes, of hearts whole. And at the foot of these votives, the gods listened not to plea alone, but to the truth that EX was part of being well. To be denied it entirely was to wither, and so it lived too, in mourning and grief. Widows combed their hair, slowly remembering hands that once moved through it. Men placed olive branches on graves, not only in tribute, but in apology, for words never said or touches withheld, in fear or pride. And sometimes they sang songs, soft ones, lullabies that had become love songs, or perhaps they were always both. And in this music, there was EX, not in climax, but in ache, the echo that lingered long after the last note had fallen away. Even the dead were not untouched by it, their graves adorned not just with wreaths, but with carvings of embraces, of joined hands, of kisses, never broken by time. And when the living passed by, they did not avert their eyes. They looked, they read, they wept, and in weeping, remembered what it meant to feel, to yearn, to connect. And this remembrance was itself sacred. Even those who chose solitude, hermits, philosophers, mystics, carried with them a flame that refused to die. They wrote of restraint, of transcendence, but also of temptation of the body calling out, in loneliness of nights, spent battling visions behind closed eyes. And in the agora, or in remote caves, they might speak of clarity of purpose, of purity, but none denied the pull, the shadow of another's voice in silence, or the sudden warmth when a stranger offered food or kindness. And in those moments, they too felt the tremble of EX, not as act, but as possibility. And this possibility made them human, and the myths reminded them that even gods fell prey to it, that Apollo pursued Daphne, that Artemis cursed those who glimpsed her bathing, that even Athena, fierce and cold, bore stories of jealousy, of denied affection. The divine mirrored the mortal. Or perhaps it was the other way around. In the festivals of Dionysus, where madness and ecstasy ruled, masks were worn, and identities slipped. And behind those masks, EX became both hidden and free. Men kissed men. Women kissed women. Wine flowed, and rules bent, or broke. And in this holy chaos, some found themselves, and others lost themselves entirely. And when the masks came off, and the sun returned, the memories stayed, not always welcome, not always understood, but never erased. And in the fading light of day, as hearths were lit and doors shut, EX curled itself into the corners, into the cracks, between stones, into the lines of faces and the hush of breath. And it waited for the next glance, the next brush of fingers, the next tale to be told. And centuries later, we look back, we read the fragments, the lines etched in pottery, the verses saved in scraps, statues chipped but proud, and in them we see not strangers, but echoes of ourselves, not perfect or pure, but real, flawed, hungry, full of fire. And we know that EX was not their secret. It was their song, their curse, their solace, their gift, that perhaps it still is. From the earliest years, the foundations of EX in ancient Greece were laid not with explicit instruction, but with gesture, gaze, silence, and imitation. A child learned not only to walk or speak, but to absorb the world through how others touched, how voices rose or fell, how eyes lingered or turned away. In the household where boys and girls grew beneath the same roofs, their paths began already to diverge. For while boys would soon be shepherded into the public realm, girls remained within walls, spaces perfumed by incense and quiet music where gestures were subtle, words veiled. But even in these enclosed spheres, EX, education, pulsed in lullabies that spoke of gods and longing, in myths told by old women that wrapped love in warning and beauty in danger. And a young girl, watching her mother braid her hair, might one day recall how those hands moved, how her father watched from the doorway, saying nothing and everything in. The silence boys, meanwhile, played outside, wrestled in the dirt, learned the names of stars and gods, and yet even as they learned courage and geometry, they also learned glances between older youths and younger ones. Lessons passed in jokes, in small gifts in the bathhouses and the gymnasium where the naked body was both vessel and symbol. Instruction was not merely academic. It was physical, philosophical, emotional. And it was here that the customs of mentorship formed, where older men took younger ones under their wing, not solely to teach them poetry or tactics, but to guide them into manhood. And this guidance was sometimes accompanied by affection, by desire, by rituals that blurred lines between pedagogy and passion. And while modern eyes might balk, the ancients inscribed such bonds into their stories, their laws, their sculptures. But these bonds were not always equal, not always free from power or confusion. And for every tale of mutual devotion, there were those of sorrow, of imbalance, of silence. Children learned from what they saw, from how adults behaved when another entered the room, from the quick hush from the door, left ajar, from questions not answered, and slowly, a language of gestures formed that preceded action, yet carried its weight in the schools of Athens, where Plato's dialogues echoed, where boys recited Homer by heart. They also spoke of love, of forms of beauty that transcended flesh, yet never fully detached from it. A youth might hear that the soul seeks what it lacks, and believe his longing was noble or divine. But in the dark of night, beneath the covers, such philosophy turned to heat, to ache, to questions with no safe answers. And for girls approaching womanhood, the rules were even more tightly stitched into fabric, into silence. Their bodies became watched not only by parents, but by the village, by the gods, and their dreams. Though rich, were policed in daylight. The mother who once sang lullabies now instructed modesty, warned of gazes, of accidental steps, of dresses too sheer, of fruits too ripe. And while boys might still run barefoot through courtyards, girls now walked slower, lowered eyes, and if they laughed too freely, it was noted and whispered, and those whispers wove around them like vines. And so the education of EX was less about act and more about restraint, about knowing before one knew what could or could not be touched. And in the festivals, where both children and adults danced in circles, where gods were honored with wine and movement, even there the child saw the shimmer of EX, how adults' bodies loosened, how songs changed tone, how shadows grew longer, and when torches flickered and night deepened, the child was led home away from what followed. And yet they remembered the scent, the sound, the look between neighbors who passed each other the next morning with a nod. And nothing more. In Sparta, the education was different. Harsher boys trained in pain and loyalty and silence, but even there, older warriors watched the young and offered mentorship not only with words, but with presence, with pride, with intensity that sometimes crossed into desire. And the boys accepted it, sometimes revered it, sometimes feared it, and spoke of it never. But it shaped them as surely as the whip. The drill, the march girls in Sparta ran, jumped, trained too, but their EX education was buried beneath expectations of strength, of motherhood, of bearing warriors, yet in their private spaces and shared baths or whispers, they too learned to desire, and to mask it with laughter, or defiance, or dreams. Throughout the Greek world, EX grew like ivy between stones, not always visible, but always present, threading through temples, through hearths, through streets, and in the city where Aphrodite's name was carved into stone, where her priestesses offered both prophecy and comfort. Children grew into roles, not by choice, but by rhythm, by tradition, by the slow unfolding of time, and behind every curtain, a lesson waited, not written in books, but in the breath, between stories, in the way a lover's name was spoken, or avoided, in the way a mother stared too long at the horizon, remembering a past she never named, and in this inheritance there was both beauty and burden. For some, it became song, for others, silence, and yet all carried it forward. The EX they learned without knowing they were learning it, and in the still hours before dawn when the house slept and only the stars remained, children dreamed not only of heroes and gods, but of closeness of hands, held of eyes, meeting of warmth, not yet known. And those dreams were the first stirrings, the first lessons, the first shapes of a future. They would one day enter fully, perhaps willingly, perhaps not, but always inevitably. In ancient Greece, EX was never only about desire or bodies. It was braided tightly with power, with legacy, with law. It existed within a framework of oaths, of lineages, of whispered transactions and carefully chosen silences. The life of a man in Athens was marked by his ability to marry not for affection, but for property, for bloodline, for alliances, and the wife he chose was often a girl, barely past childhood, offered to him by her father, not out of love, but necessity. And while this union was sanctified, it was not always intimate. Affection might come, but expectation came first. The household became a domain where EX was both required and suppressed. A man must father heirs yet, speak little of the act itself, and the woman must bear those heirs yet, know almost nothing of how or why. The night of consummation was often preceded not by gentle talk, but by ritual, by instruction, by tension. And for many women, it was not joy, but duty. And yet, within those households, glimmers of agency sometimes emerged, the sharing of warmth over winter fires, the slow building of trust amidst silence, a child born, not out of lust, but of quiet accord. And in the plays of Euripides and Sophocles, EX was both mask and mirror. The stage became a place where forbidden love's incest, betrayals, desires too raw for public speech, were brought to life, not to be judged, but witnessed. The audience laughed, gasped, wept, not because the stories were foreign, but because they were too familiar. In the shadows of the amphitheater, young lovers clutched hands. Old men shifted uncomfortably, and women watched with eyes that saw more than they ever spoke. And so drama became a release, a confession where the mask said what no face could. And in the countryside, EX followed different rhythms among farmers and shepherds. The seasons dictated affection, long winters birthed closeness, short summers sparked frenzy, and in village festivals, where wine flowed and gods were praised, bodies danced freely, faces were painted, rules loosened, and sometimes what began as ritual became more. And beneath the olive trees, behind stone walls, lovers met, not under Venus's blessing, but under necessity. Hunger, loneliness, longing that had no language but touch. And these unions were sometimes fleeting, sometimes forbidden, sometimes carried across generations in Stories never told aloud, and still in every village there were those watched too closely. A widow who never remarried a man who avoided women, a girl who laughed too loudly, and the village marked them as other, never cruelly, always. Softly averted eyes, hushed tones, questions not asked, and yet their lives were threaded through the same rituals they stood at, the same altars prayed to the same gods, and felt the same fire. And in the symposium, where men reclined on couches, drank wine, recited poems, and debated, the nature of virtue, EX, was again present, not raw, but refined, spoken of in metaphor, in riddles and myth, but present nonetheless. And the younger boys, who served the wine, who listened to every word, learned that wisdom and EX were often intertwined, that to understand beauty was to desire it, that to seek truth was to chase something both sacred and carnal. And the mentors who offered guidance often offered more. And while some bonds were kind, others, concealed in balance, and behind the polished marble and golden cups, pain sometimes nested, but none spoke of it. And in the cities, where merchants bartered and slaves toiled, EX crossed class, as well as gender, and the brothels were busy, not only with desire but survival, and among the enslaved, the body was no longer theirs. Given, traded, demanded, and yet within even this oppression, some formed bonds clung to dignity, to small gestures of resistance. A song hummed a hand, held a gaze not lowered, and the mistresses of houses often knew more than they showed the way their husbands' eyes wandered, the names of the women who came and went, the way silence fell after certain nights, and in the temples where priestesses lit incense, offered prayers, and danced barefoot upon stone, EX lived too in mystery, not in act, but in suggestion. The veil lifted not from the body, but the mind, and the goddesses, too, whom they prayed, Aphrodite, Persephone, Artemis, all bore EX in different shades, passion, death, virginity, and women sought them, not for permission, but understanding. And in these sacred spaces, some found clarity, some found torment, and others found a version of themselves they dared not speak of outside. And as years passed, and children grew, and marriages formed, and lives wound tighter, EX continued its quiet path, unspoken, not because it was shameful, but because it was known. It shaped how people walked, how they looked, how they remembered. And as old men sat in courtyards, retelling tales of war, and youth EX lingered in their silences, in the way they paused before a name in the smile that flickered and vanished, and in the homes of widows who once bore children and now sat by cold hearths. EX pulsed too, not as act, but as absence, a touch, no longer felt a breath, no longer shared. And for them, EX became memory, incense rising, slowly fading, not forgotten. In the later echoes of ancient Greece, when myths were already being written down, not just whispered, and when philosophers walked the same streets as merchants and oracles, EX remained a force, less visible, but more pervasive. It did not announce itself with trumpet or procession, but lived in the folds of conversation, in the silence between glances, and in the rituals that seemed mundane, but held generations of encoded longing, and among the women who gathered at wells in early dawn, with jugs on shoulders and sandals, damp from dew, EX passed like breath, not spoken but understood, a story half told, a look, exchanged a laughter too loud to be innocent, and these women knew the weight of eyes, the meaning of caution, the difference between a touch that warmed and a gaze that devoured, and so they learned to walk in curves, not lines to speak in suggestion, not declaration, and they braided in their daughters the same knowledge, not from scrolls, but from watching, listening, surviving, and in hidden corners of the city, where the healers lived among herbs and oils, EX had a shadow, a deeper root. Women came with questions, not only of fertility, but of affection, of distance, of betrayal. They spoke of men who no longer touched them, of dreams that disturbed, of desires they feared to name. And the healers knew that EX could be soothed, not only by potion, but by story, by listening, by ritual. And so, wax figurines were burned, knots were tied in red thread, prayers were whispered at twilight, not to make someone love, but to clear the fog within the self, to unbind what had knotted. And among the scrolls of the philosophers there were words that tangled logic with longing. Plato spoke of souls split, yearning to reunite. Aristotle questioned whether pleasure was the true good. And the cynics laughed at both, seeing EX not as virtue or vice, but as folly. And yet even they were not free of it. For to mock is also to name. To deny is also to acknowledge. And within the symposiums, where such debates swirled, there were always younger listeners, faces lit by oil, lamps, ears open, hearts confused, learning not only argument but yearning. And in the port towns where sailors drank and storytellers spun tales, EX appeared as curse and currency. Sailors spoke of women with seaweed in their hair who lured with song and vanished. With the tide they spoke of lovers met in foreign lands, whose names they never knew but remembered always. And for these men, EX was hunger and homeache and escape. And they carved names into shipwood, as if memory alone could hold what distance would erase. And in the temples, dedicated to darker gods, Hecate, Persephone, Nyx EX took stranger forms veiled in shadows, offered at crossroads or beneath new moons. Women and men came seeking not love but control. They wished to bind a heart, turn a mind, open a body. Though some rituals were desperate, others were precise-handed, down from older generations like recipes, with ingredients never spoken aloud, but always known. And in these practices, EX became spell, not sensation, intention, not impulse. And the fear was not of the gods, but of what desire might unleash. And in these practices, in the winter festivals, when masks were worn and rules relaxed, EX danced, freely cloaked in wine and rhythm and anonymity. People became not themselves, but possibilities. And what could not be spoken in daylight was lived in firelight. And though many forgot the names they kissed, they remembered the freedom, the moment of not being watched, not being named. And in these festivals, some found truths that stayed long after the embers died. They walked differently, held silence differently, and EX lingered in that difference. And among the elderly, who sat in courtyards weaving baskets or repairing nets, EX pulsed in memory, not in regret but in presence, smell of someone's hair, the feel of stolen time, the weight of a choice never reversed. And they spoke of those days not directly, but through parables, through questions posed to no one in particular. And the young who listened learned that EX did not end with youth, but transformed, became something softer, heavier, more lasting. And among the ruins, the stones that once held laughter in moans, vines now grew children, played tourists past. But some nights when the wind shifted, the stones whispered, and the earth remembered. And in the graves where lovers were buried, side by side, EX lay, too, not dead, but quiet, wrapped in stories not told. And among those who carved their names into clay jars or scratched initials into marble ledges, there was always the desire to be remembered, to have their EX not vanish. And so they left behind signs, not grand, but human, a line of verse, a locket of hair, a statue half eroded but still tender. And among the slaves who had no names in records, EX was both torment and tether, stolen and secret, and sometimes still theirs. And in their lullabies, in the rhythms of grinding grain, in the calloused hands that touched in moments stolen from toil, there were sparks not of rebellion, but of insistence, of being, of wanting. And these sparks, though ignored by history, lit fires that warmed and seared. And in the night markets, where spices mingled with sweat and coins changed hands, EX hovered in, perfume and bargaining in the gaze that lingered too long, and among those who sold flesh, or bought it, or watched it, was never just transaction. It was ritual exchange, negotiation of power and ache. And even in that harshness, there was sometimes care, sometimes cruelty, and always memory. And as Athens grew and shrank, as gods rose and fell, as wars broke and healed, EX endured, not in glory, not in fame, but in breath, in bruise, in blush. It moved from hand to mouth, to dream to silence, and it waits still in the dust, in the echoes, in the stones that once bore weight, not of empire, but of embrace. In the fields beyond Thermopylae, where blood once dried in the sun, and armor lay rusting beneath wildflowers, the echoes of EX still walked for every soldier who left his home in Sparta or Athens or Thebes. There was someone he looked back at, someone he had kissed too, quickly, or too desperately, or not at all. And in the hard mornings, when helmets were strapped and shields lifted, men carried more than weapons. They carried the weight of last touches, of whispered promises, and fears never said aloud. And in those silent columns, marching toward battle, EX followed. Not in the songs they sang, but in the absence of them, in the clenched jaws, in the stares, fixed ahead. And when death met them, sudden or slow, EX spilled with the blood, not as legend, but as longing, as memory that refused to fade. And in the camps, built near rivers and caves where fire crackled and oil lamps swayed, EX was both comfort and confusion. Some men found solace in each other, in gestures too soft for war, in words not meant for other ears. And though the world outside named such things unnatural, within the dust and sweat and dark, those touches were real, more real than the oaths sworn to distant gods. And those who returned from war changed not only in limp or scar, but in gaze. They looked at their wives, their lovers, their children, with eyes that had seen beauty in death, tenderness in brotherhood. And those looks were not always understood. Some women turned away, others leaned in asking no questions, because the answers were not for this world. And in the scrolls that chronicled victory and lost the names of the fallen were etched, but never their feelings. And yet among the shards of pottery, among the letters buried in graves, EX remains a silent witness, carved not in marble, but in the space between words. And in Sparta, where discipline ruled, and boys were torn from mothers at 7, EX was shaped in rigor, in denial, but never fully erased. Young boys trained to kill were also taught to admire the strong, the brave, the graceful, and among them, bonds grew not only of loyalty, but of fascination, of desire. And while the elders pretended such feelings were for the state, for strength, the boys knew otherwise. They knew the way hands lingered, the way eyes spoke what mouths could not. And for many, EX began not in softness, but in combat, in shared bruises, in nights spent shoulder to shoulder, watching the stars. And in Athens, where rhetoric and beauty twined, EX took other forms. It lived in the plays where gods disguised as mortals, wooed with wit and punished with passion. It danced in the marketplaces where courtesans spun tales more complex than any philosopher. And among the playwrights, like Euripides, who dared write of women's fire, of men's vulnerability, EX found voice not in truth, but in performance. And yet, performance became truth. And in every seat of the theater, someone saw themselves mirrored, their shame or desire reflected larger than life. And in the temples, where warriors brought offerings before battle, EX was a prayer not for safety, but for return, for one more night, for one more whisper. And the gods did not judge. They had their own stories of lust and betrayal of power, dressed as love, and love masked as duty. And in those divine tales, mortals found excuses, found reflections, found warning and hope. And in the wives left behind, EX grew in silence, in waiting. They touched empty beds. They folded clothes that would never be worn again. They listened for steps that never came. And in their loneliness, they dreamed not of victory, but of touch, of being seen, of being chosen again. And for some, EX turned bitter, a memory they cursed, a hunger they resented. But for others, it became rebellion. They took lovers or poetry or solitude and claimed their own fire. And in this quiet defiance, EX lived on not as treason, but as truth. And among the children born of war, EX was ghost and gift, a father's smile, carried in the curve of a lip, a mother's tear, never explained, a lullaby that spoke of battles, but meant belonging. And in these children, the war continued, not in swords, but in silence, in questions never asked, and scars never shown. And in the statues built to honor the dead, EX was hidden beneath the stone, in the tilt of a head, too tender, in the curve of lips, too soft for triumph. The sculptors knew the secrets. They chiseled them, gently hoping someone might see and understand. And among those who washed the bodies of the fallen, EX lingered in hands that moved with reverence, not just for the dead, but for the life once held, the joys never spoken, the touch never claimed. And in the letters that never reached their destinations, EX remained, ink blurred by time, promises lost in transit, but powerful still. And in dreams, EX returned wearing faces, half remembered, whispering words never spoken. And though the dreamer woke with tears, or shame, or longing, they knew that part of them had touched truth. And in this war-worn land, where glory was shouted and grief was silenced, EX lived stubbornly, not as sin, not as virtue, but as shadow, as light as breath. When the RS had ended, and the ships returned broken, and late and half-empty, the men who stepped onto dry land did not recognize the streets, nor the voices, nor even themselves. They carried with them silence, packed tighter than armor. Their eyes searched faces for memories, but found only time and the gaps it left. And EX did not greet them like a lover. It stared from windows behind veils, behind the hush of children who did not run toward them, but clung to unfamiliar mothers. And those mothers, many of whom had mourned and healed and aged, waited with hearts knotted between hope and defiance. Some reached forward, some stepped back, but no gesture undid. The years EX had frayed at the edges, had hardened into ritual, into duty. And in the quiet courtyards where olive branches swayed, men sat with hands on knees and stories on lips. But the stories stayed there bitter and heavy, because who could explain the softness of a friend dying with his hand in yours, The nights spent whispering, not prayers, but wishes, or the weight of returning when others did not. And so they touched their wives, gently, awkwardly, like learning a new dance. The women responded in kind, shaping their mouths to names that now felt foreign. And in the tangle of bodies seeking familiarity, EX became a negotiation, a trial of patience, of shame, of rediscovery. And not all found each other again. Some men left before dawn, unable to stay within walls that felt too tight, too clean, too loud. Some took to the hills, others to drink, others to younger hands that asked no questions and gave no judgment. And the wives, those who stayed, waited not out of duty, but because beneath the cracks they still saw a boy. They once loved a man who once laughed, and for them EX became something else. A slow stitching of years, a quiet tending of wounds invisible to all, but the most careful. And among those who did not return, who were said to be lost or slain, rumors clung like sea mist. Some were seen in foreign ports, smiling beside strange women. Others were said to live as shepherds with no name, with no past. Some perhaps chose not to come home, not because they didn't care, but because home had become unreachable, a shrine to what was, and EX to them was a wound that reopened at the sound of a familiar song. And in the temples, where prayers were offered for safe returns, the gods listened or didn't, but the candles still burned, and in their flicker EX danced as shadow as hope. And in the marketplaces where men once traded goods, they now traded glances, testing if laughter could return, if touch could mean more than survival. And the courtesans who once entertained with jest and wit now listened more than they spoke, because they knew war left holes, not always in flesh, but in voice, in desire, in the rhythm of want. And in this new Athens, this rebuilt Thebes EX was no longer a storm but a drought. It was not the crash of longing, but the ache of memory. And in the homes, where children asked, "Where were you? And why did you go? Why did he not come back?" EX became an answer they could not give, so they gave stories. Instead, tales of bravery, of honor, of shield walls and victories, but never of fear, never of loneliness, never of the way EX held their breath when they thought of what could have been. And in the schools where boys learned letters and laws, girls stitched hope into fabrics their mothers once wore. And when they asked about the men who stood too still at dusk, or flinched at slammed doors, the women gave them looks, not answers, because how to speak of EX that was not romantic, not noble, but raw, that tasted of ash, and old sweat, and unfinished songs. And still in every village, in every port, a woman watched the road at dusk, and a man watched the sky at dawn, hoping for something they could not name. And in their dreams, EX returned, not always as a person, but as a scent, a laugh, a warmth across the shoulders. And they woke, not crying, but quiet, staring at ceilings and remembering nothing and everything. And in this new peace, EX did not disappear. It changed. It settled into the bones. It moved into gestures, like the way a man fixed his tunic before entering a room, or the way a woman lit the lamp, just so. And in the statues newly raised to honor the fallen, the sculptors now added softness, the curve of a jaw, the reach of a hand, not to a weapon, but to another. And though no inscription named EX, the marble knew. And when the children grew into the silence their fathers carried, they too learned to speak without words, to touch, without claiming to love, without knowing. And so EX, in this Greece, no longer marched or sang. It lingered. It echoed in alleys, in temples, in the folds of linen drying on stone. And though time wore the names from memory, EX remained a presence, not asked for, not explained, but felt in the hush before a kiss, in the pause between sentences, in the way the wind changed when you said I'm home. In the later years when the temples felt quieter and the winds came with the scent of figs, not fire the men who once bore swords, now carried walking, G-sticks, and stories, their bodies bent not from battle, but from time. And EX became not a pursuit, but a memory shaped by silence, and retelling, and error. Some claim they remembered every touch, every whisper, every night beneath the moon. But others knew that memory lies, that it sweetens what was bitter and softens what was sharp. And yet in those lies was comfort, and the comfort became a ritual, like the oil rubbed into dry knees, or the bread broken at dusk slowly without haste, as if the act itself was sacred, and the widows of warriors and merchants and poets who had once braided their hair for someone's eyes now braided it for the sake of habit. And when they spoke of love, they rarely used names. They used moments. They said the time it rained, and he laughed, or the time she didn't leave when she should have. And EX in those stories was not fire, but ember, not hunger, but warmth. And in the agora, where the old gathered like birds on a fence, EX was debated and mourned and celebrated with wine. In contradiction, one said EX was better when forbidden. Another said no, it was best in marriage when trust grew like vines. But all agreed it had changed, not because the world changed, but because they had. And the young, who listened in half-bored, half-curious ways, did not know yet that EX is understood only in the echoes. And the old, who once danced without shame, now moved slowly, not because they lacked desire, but because they feared breaking what had taken years to mend. And in this Greece of gray temples and creaking steps, EX became something spoken with eyes, not lips. It lived in gestures, like the way a woman refilled a cup before being asked, or the way a man adjusted his robe when a certain woman passed. And those whose lovers had died spoke to shadows at dawn, or placed flowers not on graves, but on doorsteps, hoping someone would know. And in the festivals, once so vibrant with song, and promised the old still watched from steps their hands, tapping knees in time with drums, but their minds elsewhere remembering the heat of a glance, the first stumble of fingers, the first unspoken invitation. And EX, in those memories, had no flaws, no regrets, only rhythm and laughter. And the old priests, who had once warned against desire, now lit candles in private, asking the gods to forgive their own dreams. And in dreams, EX came back, not as youth, not even as a person, but as a feeling, a moment between breathing and waking, where the world held still and everything felt possible again. And the women who never married, who chose solitude or secrecy, told no stories, but carried them in silence. And sometimes when a breeze caught their veil just so one might see the corner of a smile. And no, and in this Athens, now slow and golden, where the columns cast long shadows, EX walked with everyone unseen, but not unfelt. It waited in kitchens, in olive groves, in the way fingers brushed when passing a bowl. And the statues no longer stood for warriors, but for poets, and mothers, and lovers. And, in their curves, EX lived unashamed, and in the eyes of those statues, sculptors carved, not triumph, but tenderness. And when the sun set over stone roofs, the old sat and watched it, like an old friend, And in the hush of that watching, they remembered not the names, not the places, but the feelings, the hunger, the joy, the ache of absence. And when they spoke to the stars, it was not for glory or healing, but simply to say, I felt something, and I still do. And in that feeling, EX lived more real than history, more true than legend. It was not loud, but enduring, not mighty, but deep. And in the final days, breath was shallow, and eyes searched ceilings for answers. EX came like a tide, quiet, certain pulling them not back, but inward. And those who sat at their side felt the presence too. And sometimes they wept, not because of death, but because they understood at last what EX had always been, a thread. Light a single note in a song that never ended. And when the last words were spoken, they were often not names, but murmurs, sounds that meant everything and nothing. And the listeners nodded, as if to say, yes, I know. And the gods who watched, who once demanded purity and sacrifice, now watched in silence, no longer judging, no longer distant, because even they understood that EX is what made mortals divine. And in the final breath of an old man in Sparta, or a widow in Delphi, or a merchant's son in Athens, there was not fear, but memory. And in that memory, EX rose not as shame, but as prayer. And the world turned, and olives ripened, and goats bleated, and children laughed, unaware that they too would one day understand that EX was never just about the body or even the heart, but about the quiet, knowing that once someone saw you and stayed, and in that staying you became real, and that was enough. In the hills above Thebes, where the olive trees leaned against the wind, and the stones stayed warm long after sunset, there were men who swore off desire, not because they lacked it, but because they feared its power. They dressed, simply spoke, rarely, and lived in silence. But even there, EX was not absent. It lingered like a ghost between the syllables. They chose not to say. And in the hours before dawn, when the sky was the color of bruised grapes, they walked the worn paths with thoughts heavy. Their sandals, the philosopher said, desire must be mastered, not denied. And EX was the trickiest of all, because it wore the mask of need, and yet behind that mask was always something deeper, longing for recognition, for surrender, for meaning. And the Stoics trained their minds to see EX as a test, not a treasure, a chance to practice control. And so they whispered to themselves in their cells, no pleasure is worth losing the self. And they believed it most days. But there were nights when a scent on the wind, or the echo of laughter would break through, and they would press fingers to lips and pretend it did not matter, but it did. And in their journals, hidden from the eyes of students, they wrote of dreams. Dreams not of flesh, but of presence, of sitting beside someone who asked nothing, but gave everything. And the Pythagoreans counted not only numbers, but moments of weakness, and they feared music, not for its noise, but for the way it awakened EX in the soul. And so they banned certain harmonies, certain dances, certain stories, because EX entered through the ear, long before it reached the skin. And the priests of Apollo, who claimed to be vessels of light, struggled most with the shadows of desire. Because how could one carry purity when the heart begged for a warmth? And they prayed to their God with a trembling. Only they knew they offered sacrifices, not to honor EX, but to bury it, yet still in the glow of the temple flame. They saw shapes, not divine, but human. And the human was always beautiful, always dangerous. And the women who chose solitude, not out of calling, but of necessity, learned to fold their longing into herbs and chants. And when they rubbed oil into their arms, They did so slowly, as if remembering what it was to be touched. And in the baths where silence was law, the warmth of water stirred something ancient and forbidden, and no one spoke of it, but all knew. And when eyes met across the steam, the glance held lifetimes, and the vow of silence became a form of speech. The kind that says, I see you, I know you, I remember. And in the quiet villages where stories spread like vines, the oldest women told tales not just of gods and monsters, but of lovers who never touched yet, still burned. And those stories stayed not for their heat, but for their ache. And in the amphorae buried deep beneath houses, scholars found inscriptions, not of conquest or law, but of longing lines that read, I waited, and he never came. Or, she kissed me with her silence, and that was enough. And in the plays of Euripides and Sophocles, where passion led to ruin, EX was not the villain, but the mirror showing us how close we stood to breaking. And the actors who played lovers on stage wept not for the script, but for their own remembering. And the audience wept, too, because they recognized the lies they told themselves about what they wanted and what they gave up. And in the scrolls passed between students, EX was often disguised as philosophy, but always returned to the body, not the flesh, but the trembling before the touch, and the silence after. And the thinkers, who claimed to rise above desire, wrote the most about it, proving that denial is just another form of devotion. And in the sacred groves where initiates fasted and waited for visions, EX came not as an image, but as a question, a whisper saying, who have you touched, truly? Who has touched you truly? And they did not answer aloud, but they knew. And in the temples to Demeter, where women gathered to mourn and laugh and bleed, EX was in the sharing and the braiding of hair, in the holding of hands during pain, and no man understood that fully, but the gods did, and they watched, not with judgment, but with envy, because the gods could not feel what mortals did, and that feeling was EX. And in the marketplaces where widows sold olives and oracles muttered truths, EX passed, like a shadow, a memory between breaths, and even the statues that lined the road's faces worn smooth by time held the suggestion of EX. In the curve of a lip, in the tilt of a hip, because the sculptors had known and they had carved, not marble, but memory, and in the end, the silence of the ascetics, the chants of the priests, the writings of the scholars, and the songs of the washerwomen all told the same story. EX is not always loud, urgent. Sometimes it is still and watching. Sometimes it is the hush before the storm, or the echo after a name is spoken into the dark. And in the caves where monks hid from the world, they dreamed not of paradise, but of the one they left, behind the one who said nothing, but whose absence filled the air, like incense. And in that absence they finally understood. EX was never something to be overcome, only understood and held, and let go and held again, like breath, like prayer, like life itself. In the marble halls of Athens where debates speak, arced like flint against stone, and the weight of every word was a blade poised above the Republic, EX moved like a quiet rumor, not merely behind closed doors, but etched into the very structure of alliances and power. To share a bed was not merely to share warmth, but to swear something older than loyalty and more binding than law. Among the elite, EX became a currency, traded with careful intention, and within those fleeting encounters, oaths were whispered into skin, promises sealed with breath, and betrayal carried the taste of remembered mouths. Alcibiades, more beautiful than most men should be, did not only seduce for pleasure, but for purpose, and his passage through the highest courts left behind not only sighs, but shifts in power. And those who thought themselves immune found their decisions changed after one night, not because they were weak, but because EX was stronger than pride in Sparta, where boys trained beside each other from childhood until blood was common and silence sacred. EX was forged through pain and proximity. The bond between lovers was not a luxury, but a necessity, something the state encouraged because men who had touched in trust would never flee the battlefield. Their fingers knew the shape of each other's scars. And when death came, it came not as an enemy, but as a shared fate. Plato wrote of the love between men, not as sin but as transcendence. And while later scholars sanitized his meaning, the truth remained in the spaces between his lines. EX was a ladder. He claimed from flesh to form, from desire to divinity, and each rung bore the name of someone remembered. And in Delphi, where the Pythia's voice guided kings and ended wars, those who interpreted her murmurs knew the power of closeness, learned to listen not only to prophecy, but to each other's breathing. Because EX was not only flesh, but focused to look upon someone fully, to know them beyond appearance was to enter into dangerous knowing. And the priests feared this more than heresy because it unseated doctrine, and in the city of Corinth, known for its wealth and its shadows, EX was a transaction and a trap. The heterae-educated companions wielded more influence than senators, because they understood what politicians never did, that the body could sway the mind more than any speech, and that wisdom whispered through lips, slick with wine, was more enduring than any decree. And in the court, when trials were held over betrayal, over stolen secrets and broken pacts, there was often an untold story. The witness would not speak aloud. A night shared, a vow made beneath sweat-soaked sheets, and in failing to honor that vow, the defendant had not just broken law, but broken EX. And the jury, even if unaware, felt that justice was not always blind. Sometimes it blinked at the memory of a face once close enough to taste in the symposiums, where wine flowed and minds stretched. The lines between debate and desire blurred. Socrates claimed not to care for beauty, but listened more intently when beautiful mouths spoke, and the dialogues preserved that intimacy, not in content, but in cadence, because EX was not always in what was said, but how it was said. And in the hush that followed, in the temples where oaths were sworn, EX lingered like incense, the promise of devotion often paired with the promise of touch. And those who prayed for victory in battle knew better than to do so alone. They brought with them those whose presence had once held them together, through fear and in touching fingers before marble gods. They remembered that the body too was an altar, and in the prisons where enemies of the state awaited trial or death, EX returned not as memory, but as mercy, a stolen kiss through bars, a whispered name beneath breath. And even in the dim cells where light was rationed and hope rare, EX offered brief absolution, not of sin, but of solitude. And when the wars dragged on and messages failed, the generals remembered, not maps or numbers, but letters penned in haste, sealed with wax and desire. "I am yours," they wrote. "If I fall, remember me, and if I live, I will not let you forget." And these were not letters of passion, but of possession. To touch someone was to mark them, and no armor could prevent that. And in the shadows of the Acropolis, where politics and theater collided, EX was both costume and script. The actor who leaned too close, the playwright who embedded longing into every line, not for drama, but for confession. And the audience gasped, not at betrayal, but at recognition. They too had touched someone they should not have had, wanted someone forbidden, had offered something they could not name. And in those moments, EX rewrote the law, not in ink, but in ache. And the lawmakers knew this, feared it, because what cannot be named cannot be punished. And in the gardens where secrets were passed in citrus and shade, EX bloomed like jasmine, unnoticed until too late. The envoy who delayed, departure the philosopher who lingered near the servant, the general who bent to tie a sandal and brushed a wrist, each gesture harmless, each mom loaded. And in the statues commemorating triumph, EX appeared again, not in glory, but in posture. The way a hand rested on another's shoulder, the softness in the eyes of stone figures meant to be fierce, because even the sculptors remembered. And the stone carried their longing, and in the stories, passed down the ones not written, but whispered, EX was always present. The reason behind the fall of heroes, the wound that never healed, and in those tales the gods did not punish desire, but played within it, used it to stir mortals toward chaos or greatness, and mortals never learned, because EX was not meant to be mastered, only moved through. And so in every power built upon alliance, there was EX behind it. In every fall that followed pride, there was EX beneath it. And in the silence after judgment, the echo of what was never spoken lingered, and would always linger. When the body stopped breathing, and the mouth grew still, EX did not vanish. It lingered like a scent, like the last warmth in a blanket. Left behind, EX followed the soul to the edge of the underworld and whispered in the ears of the dying, not to fear the river, but to remember the hands that once held them. It was said that if one died, thinking of a lover, their soul found the passage easier, as if love softened the sticks and gave the boatman pause. Funerals in ancient Greece were never only for the dead, they were also for the living who remained behind with the memory of touches that could no longer be returned. Women wailed and tore their robes, but it was often the secret companions, the unnamed, the overlooked, who wept in silence, burying not only a body, but a part of themselves. When the pyres were lit and the smoke rose, the ashes carried more than flesh. They carried memory, and EX was never heavier than in that smoke. Those who loved and lost often returned at night to where the flames had been tracing the soot, with their fingers whispering names into earth, hoping the gods would return. Just one moment, EX became a ghost, not of fear, but of longing. And in the tombs, carved for warriors, the murals spoke more truth than the speeches. They did not show conquest, but connection. Two men seated closely, two women passing a lyre. The space between them charged, not with battle, but with something softer and heavier. The kind of knowing that required no witness. And even in Hades, where the dead wandered in shades, EX left its mark. Orpheus descended not for glory, but for touch. The touch of Eurydice lost and nearly found. And in turning back, he taught us all that EX cannot be reclaimed once left behind. And yet, we keep trying. Each time someone lights a candle for the departed. Each time a letter is placed in a grave. Each time a name is carved into stone. EX returns, not as fire, but as flicker. And in Eleusis, where Demeter mourned, and the mysteries grew thick with smoke and secrecy, EX was embedded in the rituals, the reenactments of descent and return, the grain that died and rose again. Each participant felt the press of presence, those they had touched and those they had only imagined. Touching EX was the thread, through it all a binding force between now and not yet in dreams. The dead often return not to haunt, but to remind their eyes familiar, their gestures known. And the dreamer woke, not with fear, but with an ache that lasted all day, because some parts of EX never sleep. In Sparta, fallen warriors were honored, not just for their strength, but for the bonds they left behind, the partner who stood at the funeral, their silence louder than any trumpet. The one who knew the way. The dead man laughed when he was tired, or how he tied his sandals, or the words he never said aloud. Those memories were guarded more fiercely than weapons, and when the next battle came, the survivor carried both shield and grief. Athens was no different beneath its intellect and art. The city pulsed with mourning love stories, half told, or hidden, entirely because to name them was dangerous, but to forget them was worse. And so poems were written in double meanings, plays filled with glances that said more than entire monologues. The stage became a cemetery of affection, where the dead danced with the living for a single act and left again. In the countryside, where the gods felt closer, and the night's darker lovers met under fig trees and swore oaths they could never keep. I will find you. If I die, I will wait for you beyond the veil. And when one did not return, the other looked for signs. A shadow in the well water, a wind that spoke their name, EX, taught mortals to lie to time, to pretend that endings were only pauses, and some built altars, not for the gods, but for the ones they missed, laying flowers and offerings, as if hunger could reach beyond the grave. Mothers buried sons who had never married but spoke too, often of a friend whose letters they kept folded and worn, and in that keeping was truth unspoken. EX did not need confirmation. It grew in the gaps, the cracks, the places no torch could reach. And when winter came and the hearths burned low, was not just warmth that was missed, but wait the curve of another body, beside you the breath that fogged your shoulder, the silence that once said everything. Even the gods were not immune. Zeus searched for lovers long lost, and Artemis kept the company of those who reminded her of someone who had once sung to her in a forest clearing. They too mourned, though eternity dulled the edges of pain, and in this mourning they became more mortal in pottery fragments unearthed. Thousands of years later, two figures touch, not in lust, but in comfort. Painter, long gone, but the emotion preserved brushstroke by brushstroke. EX survived. The ruin of empires, the decay of temples, the fall of marble, and in surviving, proved that it was stronger than stone. Those who wander ruins today may feel it a shiver when standing where vows were once whispered, or breath caught for no reason at all. EX does not end with death. It only changes. Form becomes memory, becomes legend, becomes the reason a name is spoken aloud, even when no one else remembers why. And so EX continued, in every flower placed at a shrine, in every coin left on a grave, in every song hummed while looking at stars. EX waited patient, unblinking, and in that waiting became eternal. In ancient Greece, EX was not confined to bedrooms or whispered promises. It bled into coin, and contract became part of the economy, as real as olive oil or grain girls were given as dowries to secure alliances, their EX potential bundled with amphorae of wine and bolts of dyed linen. Fathers traded the future bodies of their daughters like farmland, and in this transaction, EX became wealth. A virgin's value counted in livestock or silver. The younger, the more unspoiled, the higher the price. And yet, behind these calculations were eyes that dared to glance across markets, not with submission, but with something sharper, sometimes even defiant. Not all EX was purchased outright. Some was leased in the shadows of temples, where women stood, not as wives, but as heterae companions, whose intellect matched their beauty, their conversations bought by the rich, powerful, who whispered secrets between caresses. These women wielded EX not as surrender but as strategy. They learned the politics of skin, the leverage of knowing a senator's fear or a general's weakness. And while wives wove wool in dim rooms, Hetairai built empires of influence in corridors laced with perfume, their homes more gilded than many palaces, their laughter more feared than swords. But elsewhere, in darker corners, EX had no candles or silks. It lived in the bruised arms of the enslaved bodies, traded not for affection, but as labor, as punishment, as property boys taken from villages used as toys for the cruel, under the guise of pederasty, their innocence chalked up to culture, and their pain hidden in philosophies that dressed violation as education. Men excused themselves with Plato's words and Aristotle's justifications, speaking of noble love, while their hands betrayed their lips. EX, in this form, was not connection but conquest. And yet, even here, fragments of humanity survived a stolen glance, a shared piece of bread, a moment when suffering softened into something briefly gentle in the agora, where deals were struck, and voices shouted over baskets of dates. EX moved too cloaked in flirtation, in gifts slipped into, hands in questions about family that meant something else. Entirely merchants from far lands brought more than spices. They brought new shapes of desire, stories of temple, rites in Cyprus, of priestesses who anointed with oil before each union and promised visions of gods through pleasure. Foreign EX was both feared and desired, exoticized yet craved, and the more unfamiliar, the more dangerous. But the lure was strong enough that Athenians sometimes disguised themselves to taste what they publicly condemned, even in Sparta, known for steep and silence. EX was currency brides, shave their heads too, mimic boys on wedding nights to ease the transition for husbands raised on male companionship. EX was molded to fit needs rather than truths, and in doing so became myth. The myth that love could be taught like combat, that the heart was malleable. Under order in Delphi, where Apollo spoke through the Pythia EX dance between prophecy and payment, pilgrims paid for blessings, and behind the veil, priestesses sometimes offered more than riddles. Their touch interpreted as divine connection, an oracle, not of words, but warmth, and the seeker left feeling seen, though nothing had been spoken in coins. Gifts. EX persisted a current beneath every trade route, as real as salt in Thessaly. Horses were valued, but women more so for the airs they could provide, and the way their beauty could distract a rival in negotiation, and the sharpest traders knew when to press an advantage, and when to invite EX. The table not overtly, but implied, through seating arrangements and glances, through the lingering of a hand on amphora, as one poured wine. And so the symposiums, where men reclined on couches and debated law and poetry, also became theaters of EX. Wine-flowed minds softened, and the courtesans moved like smoke between cushions, listening, recording, remembering for later, for leverage. Even among philosophers who scorned the body as base, EX found root. Socrates spoke of soul's attraction, yet the way his eyes followed, Alcibiades told another tale. EX was debated as ideal, but felt as instinct, and in this contradiction, it thrived, always slipping between definitions, never fully caught, never fully shamed. Some men carved statues of their desires, polished marble thighs and lips that never answered back. Artists captured the longing they dared not voice, and sold it as beauty to the state. And even when the statues were clothed in myth, they revealed truths naked and eternal. In Athens, brothels paid taxes to the state. EX. As revenue, the city flourished from what it publicly scorned, and beneath the Acropolis, men bought moments they couldn't name, and women survived by pricing what others took by force. Behind doors marked with oil lamps, the economy breathed heavy and fast. Some tried to escape its grasp to love without weight. But even there, EX was marked by means. Who could afford to chase a heart across islands? Who could write poems without needing to eat? And so, love became a luxury, and longing a pastime of the rich. The poor loved too, but their EX was tethered to reality, to hunger, to winters that demanded bodies pressed for warmth, not pleasure. And even then, feelings bloomed under blankets of hardship. Kisses stolen beside Olive, Press's hands clasped during storms, not because of desire, but fear. And in those moments, perhaps, EX was most real, because it asked for nothing, but stayed because it must. And in every city-state, whether rising or falling, EX remained bartered, not just for gold, but for safety, for favor, for status. Was not always given. Sometimes it was endured. Sometimes it was all that stood between a child and hunger. And still it shaped the world in ruins. Unearthed coins bear the faces of rulers who once paid for a night they claimed never happened, their legacy etched in metal, their secrets in whispers, and still the archaeologists dig, unwrapping histories one shard at a time, finding not just tools or weapons, but love letters, scratched into pottery initials, intertwined like vines, broken now, but once whole. And if EX was trade, it was also traceable, fingerprint left in the dark, a token under a pillow, a scent that lingered after goodbye, and in that persistence, it defied transaction becoming again what it had always been, a hunger not for ownership, but for understanding. In the sacred folds of ancient Greece religion, and EX were not strangers, were often intertwined not only in temple corridors, but in the very myths whispered beside hearths. The gods themselves were no strangers to desire their immortal passions carved into marble and painted onto vases that passed from hand to hand. Zeus, the father of gods, rarely disguised his intentions. His thunderbolt, not just a symbol of power, but of virility. He descended as a swan, a bull, even a golden rain to claim mortal women, and no one questioned whether love was mutual, for in myth, consent dissolved into destiny, and the line between sacred and violation blurred. Hera, his wife, bore the fury of these escapades, not on Zeus, but on the women themselves, turning them to cows, to trees, to monsters, punished not for sinning, but for being chosen. EX was divine, but it was also dangerous. Its presence sanctified when ritualized, but condemned when unbound. Aphrodite, born of sea foam, wielded EX as her weapon. Her temples glowed with offerings not only of incense, but of longing worshippers, knelt not with prayers, but with bodies seeking visions through touch. It was whispered that her priestesses bore the goddess's spirit during rites, that their embrace could open the soul to truths otherwise hidden. And though some called it prostitution, the Greeks knew better. They called it sacred service, and believed in its power to heal, to cleanse, to elevate. In Corinth, the temple of Aphrodite stood high above the city, and from it came the famed hierodoloi, sacred companions who walked the streets, not in shame, but in honor, their fees not kept, but returned to the goddess, and through them, EX became currency of devotion. Pilgrims arrived, not only for oracles, but for communion, to be held, to be known, to be touched in a way that reminded them of their place in the cosmos, not as beasts, but as beings, touched by divinity in Eleusis, the mysteries unfolded under moonlight, where Demeter's grief for Persephone became a symbol of cycles of loss and return, of descent and emergence. And in these rituals, the body was central. The eating, the drinking, the ecstatic dances, where EX was not an act, but a state of being, a surrender to the pulse of life, to death. to rebirth. And in that surrender, people wept, not from pain, but from remembering something older than memory. In these sacred places, EX was not spoken of as dirty or forbidden. It was a bridge, a sacred rope between the human and the divine, and those who crossed it did not feel shame, but awe. The myths reinforced this again and again. Dionysus, god of wine and frenzy, tore through forests with his maenads. Women who shed their names, their duties, their husbands, to dance and scream and fall into madness, and EX for them was not only liberation, it was worship. As they entwined under trees, their voices became hymns, their moans, invocations of the wild, the ungoverned, the truth that lives beneath laws. And in that chaos, they claimed something men feared, their own agency, their own sanctity. The city tried to contain this. EX tried to make it, need to assign it, roles to force it into marriage, contracts, and dowries. But the forest always waited beyond the walls, whispering that the gods were not bound by such lines in Athens. The cult of Eros flourished, with shrines where lovers left offerings of honey, and flowers, where boys lit lamps for favorite companions, hoping their affection would glow back. And here too, EX was not just physical, it was emotional, philosophical. The idea that souls could yearn for each other across time, across form. Plato wrote of soulmates once split, now seeking reunion, and this yearning he called Eros. And though his words clothed it in lofty thought, beneath it pulsed the ache of touch, the silence between two held gazes in Sparta. Even with its stern codes, EX appeared in rituals where girls whipped boys, as part of rites of endurance, where contact was pain and lesson. And somewhere within that ritual, EX breathed, not in pleasure, but in intensity, in closeness, in the recognition of skin. The temples of Artemis spoke of another facet, the sacredness of virginity, not as repression, but as power. The priestesses who served her were untouched, not because they were lesser, but because they channeled a wild, unclaimed strength. And EX here was absence, a force not yielded, but withheld like a storm never unleashed. Their purity gave them voice, gave them vision, and men feared them not for beauty, but for boundary. The sanctuaries of Hecate, goddess of crossroads, were thick with incense and secrets. EX there took the form of choik, E of shadowed offerings left at night. Crossroads became metaphors for decisions, for temptations, for the duality of desire and consequence. Even the underworld had its EX, Hades and Persephone, their union, both abduction and eternal bond. Some said she came to love him, others said she never had a choice. But within that ambiguity lay the Greek understanding of EX, that it could be power, prison, liberation, and lament, all at once, not easily defined, not simply good or bad, but layered, and always tied to the gods' moods, to the stars' alignments, to omens and dreams. And so when women made love beneath moonlight, they often whispered prayers, not for pleasure, but for protection, for clarity, for memory, to be more than body, to be myth, to be more than forgotten. And even in tombs, EX remained. Urns depicted couples, embrace, etched with poems longing for reunion in Hades, where, perhaps in the asphodel fields, two souls might find each other again, without shame, without weight. EX, in religion, was full of contradiction. It sanctified and terrified, invited and punished, and yet it endured, because within it was the truth, that the gods themselves were moved, not only by justice or vengeance, but by touch, by longing, by the ache to connect. And in that way, mortals became closest to Olympus, Not when they built statues or sang praises, but when they reached across the void between two people and said without words, "I see you, I feel you, I am not alone." And in the silence that followed, something eternal stirred, something sacred. In the shadows of Greek tragedy, EX did not wear the veil of tenderness, but one of doom. It crawled through verses and spilled from the mouths of broken heroes who loved too deeply or not at all it was, in the silence before a scream in the hush. After blood hit marble floors for the playwrights of Athens. EX was the axis around which fate spun its cruel geometry. In the tales told on stage, EX was rarely joy. It was punishment, prophecy, perversion, a spark that led to ruin, and audiences sat, not to be aroused, but to be warned, to watch themselves in the mirror of myth and shudder for what they saw in Aeschylus's words. Clytemnestra waited, not as a widow, but as a woman. Wronged her husband, Agamemnon, had sacrificed their daughter to win a war. And while he conquered Troy, she opened her bed to another, and her rage curdled into vengeance. And when he returned, she did not greet him with kisses, but with steel. EX here was not soft but sharp. It justified the murder, the betrayal. It was not pleasure but weapon. And yet still the body was center, the act that preceded the act of killing. In Sophocles' tales, the forbidden rippled across generations. Oedipus, the king who sought truth only to find it in his mother's arms. EX became the sword that carved his destiny. And when he learned that his children were his siblings, that his wife was his mother, he did not die. He blinded himself for what he could not unsee, for the horror of touch without knowledge. Jocasta hanged herself, her silk robes now a noose. EX in tragedy was blind, was accidental, but no less damning in Euripides' hands. It turned even more bitter. Phaedra, burning with desire for her stepson, wrote lies that destroyed him, not because she hated him, but because she wanted him and could not have him. Her passion was fire turned inward, and the ashes choked them both. And in the tale of Medea, EX was memory, and weapon. She had betrayed her people, for Jason, born his children, watched him abandon her for another, and in her fury, she did not touch him again. She touched what he loved, most their children, and through their deaths, EX was avenged, not forgotten, and Jason left, not with a new bride, but with silence, and gods who turned their backs. Tragedy taught that EX was not merely a sin, it was fate, that those who crossed certain lines would not be punished by men, but by destiny itself. And these stories were not whispered. They were shouted on stage before thousands who wept and gasped and remembered that behind every pleasure, a shadow waits. Even the myths beyond the stage echoed this in the tale of Callisto. Companion of Artemis, EX came not from love, but from assault. Zeus took her shapeshifted into Artemis to deceive her, and when she bore his child, she was cast out, turned into a bear, and hunted by her own son, until gods intervened and placed them in the stars as Ursa Major and Minor, even in constellations. EX was told as loss, as distortion. Another tale told of Mira, who, driven by curse or madness, lay with her father, unknowingly, and when truth came, it split her open, literally, birthing Adonis, the child of incest and sorrow, who would be loved by Aphrodite herself. EX, here was confusion, horror, a thread that knotted every attempt at joy. And yet the Greeks kept telling these stories again and again, because somewhere within them, they saw themselves not in the monsters or the gods, but in the moment before the fall, in the silence, before the act where choice still breathed and fate had not yet closed its fist. These stories caution that EX had power, not just to bind, but to break, and the breaking was never clean. Even the gods were not immune. When Aphrodite and Ares were caught in Hephaestus's net, their passion became spectacle, their shame immortalized as laughter and lesson that not even love escapes. Consequence, not even gods are safe from ridicule. And in this the Greeks acknowledged something modern hearts still fear, that desire can be downfall, that love can betray, that the body remembers what the mind cannot, and that sometimes knowing is the cruelest cut of all. Yet for all this tragedy there was also catharsis for the Greeks. The purpose of these stories was not merely to frighten, but to cleanse by watching the worst unfold. They hoped to rid themselves of the weight of it, and perhaps in the tears shed for Oedipus or Phaedra or Medea, they purged their own fears, their own regrets, their own memories of moments when EX had been misstep or mistake, and walked away with just enough hope to try again. For the Greeks believed in cycles, in fate, but also in rebirth. And even in the ashes of tragedy, there might bloom a lesson, a vow not to repeat, not to forget, not to deny, that within every desire there is danger, and within every danger a choice. And perhaps that was the real meaning behind the masks of tragedy, not to avoid desire, but to see it clearly, to respect its fire, to fear its shadow, and to carry both with reverence and caution, as one walks the fragile bridge between what is wanted and what is wise. EX in Greek tragedy was never just about sex. It was about consequence, about the truth that all acts echo, and no passion is private, and no desire is without a mirror. And perhaps that's why these stories survive. Not because we enjoy the suffering, but because we recognize the thread within ourselves, the way one word, one look, one touch can unravel everything. And in watching their pain, we make sense of our own. EX was the cord that tied gods to mortals, mortals to madness, and madness to meaning. And in the quiet, after the chorus stopped singing, when the torches burned low, and the audience dispersed into Athenian night, perhaps they held their lovers differently, spoke their desires more softly, or simply looked up at the stars and remembered that even they are born of stories of EX, of mistakes of light that took eons to arrive and still burns. In the hush of marble halls and under the olive trees of the Athenian agora, the question of EX did not escape the minds of those who sought wisdom, the philosophers of ancient Greece, those who pondered the nature of existence, ethics, virtue, and the ideal form, also turned their minds to the matter of desire of the flesh, and what it meant to be ruled by it or to master it. And thus the discourse on EX was not confined to whispers or shadows, but placed boldly beside questions of justice, truth, and beauty. Socrates himself never wrote a word, but in the dialogues of Plato, his student, he emerges as a man both sensual and detached, a figure who challenged the young men of Athens to consider the shape of their souls as well as their bodies in the symposium, a feast of minds as well as mouths. The topic of EX is laid bare, and each man speaks of love, of longing, of what it means to seek another body, and through it, perhaps, to glimpse the divine. And Socrates, sitting barefoot and plain unmoved by wine, speaks last, and in his words, we find the ladder of love, a vision, not of bodies intertwined, but of spirits ascending for him. EX is a beginning, not an end, a spark that draws the lover upward from one beautiful boy to all beautiful bodies, to the beauty of the soul, then the beauty of knowledge, and finally to beauty itself, the ideal form, unchanging, perfect, eternal. Thus, in Socratic thought, EX is not sin, but initiation, the first rung on the ascent to wisdom. But even as Socrates speaks of transcending the flesh, he is not immune to its draw. Alcibiades, young, beautiful, ambitious, storms into the symposium, drunk and full of love for Socrates. He declares how he tried to seduce him, how he lay with him, but Socrates never touched him, never sought more than words, and yet left him feeling naked, vulnerable. Changed EX in this moment is not consummation but refusal, a tension that transforms. And in that tension, Socrates wields more power than any conquest. For he controls not the body of another, but his own desire. Plato takes this vision further, and in his Republic seeks a city of the just, where EX has its place, but not its reign. He proposes guardians who share wives and children, who do not know private families for the sake of unity. EX is a function, a tool for breeding harmony, not pleasure. And yet he also hints that those who glimpse the divine might find in the love of youth a mirror to heaven always. It is the form, not the function, the ideal, not the act that holds power. Aristotle, more grounded, sees EX through the lens of biology, ethics, and purpose. He does not romanticize it, but seeks its role in the good life. For man is not a beast, nor is he a god. And to flourish, he must find balance. EX must be guided by reason. It cannot rule the soul, but nor can it be ignored, for repression is as dangerous as indulgence. Aristotle warns that habits shape the soul, and EX is one of the most potent of habits, thus to practice temperance, to enjoy without excess, to seek what is fitting. This is the path of virtue, and in his politics, he sees EX as part of the household, the realm of women and children and order. The polis must regulate it, not to destroy it, but to channel it toward harmony and strength. And so EX becomes a civic concern, as much as a personal one, and elsewhere in the schools of thought that bloom like vines across Athens, EX takes many forms. The Epicureans, followers of Epicurus, declare that pleasure is the highest good, but not the pleasure of gluttony, or lust, rather. Absence of pain, the peace of body and soul. For them, EX is natural, but not necessary. It can bring joy, but it can also bring turmoil. Thus, the wise man does not chase it, but accepts it when it brings tranquility. The Stoics, led by Zeno, walk a stricter path. They see emotion as the enemy of reason, and EX is no exception. The passions must be subdued, not out of shame, but out of strength, for the soul that is ruled by desire is a slave, and the free man is indifferent to pleasure and pain alike. And yet even the Stoics make room for love, for marriage, for connection, but always under the dominion of reason, not impulse. And among them are examples of men who remain celibate, not from prudery, but from discipline. EX is not denied. It is mastered, and this mastery becomes virtue. And so across the spectrum of thought, from the hedonist to the ascetic, the Greek philosophers circle the truth that EX is both danger and doorway. It can uplift or degrade it, can lead to the divine or to despair. And the key lies not in the act, but in the soul that acts, in how one approaches the other, not as object, but as being with its own reason, its own worth. And in this, the Greeks speak to a modern heart still confused, still pulled by the tides of flesh and spirit. And in their words, we find not prescriptions, but provocations, not laws, but lessons, that EX is not simple, not shallow, not separate from the search for meaning, but woven through it, a thread that can fray or fortify the fabric of the self. And perhaps this is why, even in the silence of centuries, the voices of Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, Zeno still echo, not to tell us what to do, but to remind us to ask why, and in the asking, to find in our own desires, not shame, but clarity, not chains, but mirrors, and in those mirrors to meet ourselves anew. And so the dialogues continue, not just in books, but in bedrooms, in hearts, in choices made in whispers, and in wonder. Finally, to beauty itself, perfect and eternal beyond all flesh and form. This was not a rejection of EX, but a reorientation, an elevation of its power to something metaphysical. And in this Socratic vision, EX became a sacred compass, pointing the soul toward truth. But not all shared this ascension. Plato himself vacillated between reverence and caution. His Republic speaks of guardians untouched by desire, their passions sublimated into loyalty to the state, and yet in the Phaedrus, love between men is likened to the wings of the soul, fluttering at the memory of divine forms encountered before birth. And EX becomes a madness, a divine madness, which if properly guided can lead the lover to recollection and virtue, but if corrupted to shame and ruin. Thus, in Plato, EX is both peril, promise, both anchor and sail. Meanwhile, Aristotle, more rooted in the world than his teacher, approached EX. As part of the natural order, he classified types of friendship, one of which stemmed from pleasure and another from virtue. And while he believed that rational control should guide the appetites, did not reject EX. He merely sought to place it in harmony with reason. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he wrote of continence and incontinence, temperance and indulgence, and he considered the role of pleasure in a flourishing life, seeing in measured enjoyment, not sin, but balance. The Stoics, by contrast, often saw EX as a threat to tranquility. Zeno, and later, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, taught that virtue was the only good and passion a source of bondage. The wise man, they claimed, was indifferent to pleasure and pain, to desire and disgust. He mastered his impulses and found peace in discipline. And yet, even among Stoics, there was nuance. Musonius Rufus, for example, argued that EX within marriage could be virtuous if governed by mutual respect and purpose, while for Epictetus, EX was not evil, but merely dangerous, like fire. Beautiful when controlled, destructive when left wild. The Epicureans, often misunderstood as hedonists, placed their highest value on ataraxia, peace of mind. And in this vision, EX was neither exalted nor vilified, but approached with care. Epicurus warned that desires must be distinguished: those that are natural and necessary, such as food and friendship; those that are natural but unnecessary, such as EX; and those that are neither, and therefore to be avoided. EX then was like honey on the tongue, delightful perhaps, but likely to stir disturbance, jealousy, longing, grief. Better to befriend the soul than to chase the body. And so in the gardens of Epicurus, EX was welcome, but not worshipped. It came when it came, and was not mourned when it did not. For the cynics, however, EX was both rebellion and revelation. Diogenes lived in a barrel and performed his bodily functions in public, challenging every norm, including those of modesty and sexual decorum. For him to blush at desire was hypocrisy, and he once claimed to masturbate in the marketplace, saying, if only it were as easy to relieve hunger by rubbing one's stomach. And while his provocations shocked, they were also teachings pointing to the absurdity of custom and the liberation of the self from shame. The Pythagoreans, meanwhile, saw in EX a disruption of harmony. Their cosmology was based on number, on proportion, on balance. And the act of EX, especially uncontrolled, was a dissonant note in the music of the spheres. They promoted chastity and restraint, believing that spiritual purity required bodily discipline, and that the soul in its migration through lives was stained by the passions of the flesh. In their temples, silence was golden and solitude sacred. And EX, like a shout in a quiet hall, was avoided, not out of disgust, but out of devotion. In all These schools, we find not a single answer but a constellation of beliefs. Some sought to transcend the body, some to discipline it, some to honor it as part of the whole, and others to expose the hypocrisy of those who feared it. And in the quiet of Athenian nights, where oil lamps flickered and fig trees swayed, the thinkers of Greece wrestled not only with logic and cosmos, but with a soft tug of longing, the heat of breath against skin, the mystery of connection. For even in the pursuit of truth, the ache of the human heart could not be denied. And thus, EX was philosophy's silent companion, always at the edge of thought, at the root of question, waiting, not just to be touched, but to be understood. Before the philosophers etched their dialectics into the marble of thought, the poets sang. And in their verses, EX was not a puzzle to be solved, but a fire to be felt, a wave that crashed without apology. The earliest voice among them, Hesiod, spoke of origins of Gaia and Uranus locked in union of Kronos, who rose from the secretions of EX to overthrow his father of Aphrodite, born from the foam that bloomed from a severed groin and floated ashore. Already beautiful, already irresistible in Hesiod's cosmogony, EX was not mere pleasure. It was revolution, birth, violence, power. It fractured the heavens and made the gods. And in this origin, one finds the seed of Greek ambivalence toward desire. It is the engine of creation and the reason for war, the source of joy and the doom of King Sappho, whose fragments float to us across the broken ages, sang with a voice that pierced through centuries. She wrote of trembling knees of fire, racing beneath skin of longing so potent it became sickness of lovers, who were more than companions. They were spells that unraveled the self on the island of Lesbos. Her verses wrapped themselves around women, around glances and whispered names and soft flesh. She called to Aphrodite as a friend and tormentor, and in her lines EX was neither male nor female. It was just fire, unshaped, unyielding. She described love as sweet bitter glucopikron, and in that word held the paradox of all passion, honey and blade Eros with his bow and wings is often remembered as a playful cherub, but in Sappho and in earlier myth, he was a force to be feared, capricious as wind, cruel as drought. In some traditions, he was older than the gods, a primordial chaos that bled into form, and he struck not only mortals, but immortals, binding Zeus and Hera, binding Ares and Aphrodite, even binding the heart of the cold Artemis with hidden ache. And so the poets knew that EX was a tyrant. With a crown of roses, the epic bards, too, did not shy from desire in Homer's Iliad. Helen is both victim and spark, her beauty, the cause of ships, her choice, the ruin of men. And yet she is also a prisoner of the gods of fate, of dreams and regrets. And in the Odyssey, Penelope remains faithful for 20 years. But around her, EX hovers in the guise of suitors, in the pressure of time, in the ache of absence. Odysseus, for his part, lies with Circe, and Calypso EX is part of his journey, not a distraction, but a test and a teaching. And when he finally returns to Ithaca, the reunion is both political and erotic. The bed unmovable, the secret sign of shared flesh and memory. The Orphic hymns sang of Dionysus torn, and reborn of Persephone, abducted and trembling of the mysteries that wove EX into the underworld, into death and return. And in these sacred songs, EX was the key to transcendence, through pleasure, through pain, through ritual, through dance, through the shedding of self and the embracing of shadow. And then there were the dramatists. Euripides gave us Phaedra mad with longing, for her stepson consumed by a fire she could neither name nor douse. And in Hippolytus, desire is sickness, and silence is poison. And the gods are not healers, but fanners of flame. In the Bacchae Dionysus returns to Thebes, and with him comes EX wild, and strange, and feminine, and fierce. And the women leave their homes to worship in frenzy, tearing beasts with bare hands, intoxicated, not with wine but with release, and the city falls to chaos, not because EX is evil, but because it was denied too long, too sternly, too violently. And when it finally returns, it does not knock. It bursts in and remakes the world. Aeschylus in his Oresteia embeds EX in the cycle of blood. Clytemnestra murders Agamemnon not only for his crimes, but for her own desire, her affair, her autonomy, her fury, and the bed becomes both witness and weapon. In Sophocles, Antigone love and duty war, and EX become entwined as the heroine defies the king, not for lust, but for something born in the same place, in the gut, in the fire, in the refusal to kneel. And so, Greek literature across centuries carved a monument to EX, not as pleasure alone, but as force, as fate, as fracture. It was sung, it was feared, it was prayed to and fled from it, entered the body, and left it marked. And in the amphitheaters of Athens, the people sat and wept, not only for kings and warriors, but for lovers whose bodies undid them, whose touch became legend, whose sorrow became scripture. Poets were not moralists, they were mirrors. They showed Greece to itself, and in the trembling hands of a bride, or the broken voice of a betrayed man, in the lingering scent of a lover gone, or the soft rustle of linens at dawn, they wrote the truth. The flesh remembers, even when the mind forgets. And EX, in their lines, was never simple, never safe, but always sacred. And if the poets knew anything, it was this, that EX is older than words, and deeper than laws, that it makes fools of philosophers and gods of shepherds, that in every whisper, every sigh, every tear on a cheek or claw on a back, there is a story, older than Homer and sadder than myth. They knew that even when the tongue stilled, the body spoke, and even when the bed lay cold, the dream did not. And so they wrote, not to explain, but to witness, not to teach, but to remember, because in remembering there is a kind of prayer, and in every prayer there is a hunger that has no name and no end. Only echo, only silence, only the slow breath of night, waiting for a touch that may never return, and still hoping that it will. There were places in ancient Greece where EX was not merely hidden, but ritualized, forbidden, sanctified, not in temples, but in the cracks between them, behind veils, behind vows. The myths whisper of these places. They are not shouted in the agora, but murmured in the shadows of olive trees passed from lips to lips like secrets too sharp to hold in full. The priestesses of Artemis were sworn to chastity, and yet the myths betray their bodies. They dance, they bleed, they run through the woods with skin painted and hair, wild hunted and hunting. And in that paradox lies the unspoken truth, that denial is not absence, and oath is not immunity. The more sacred, the vow, the more powerful, the tremble. The gods themselves broke their own rules. Zeus came cloaked, as swan, as bull, as golden rain. EX was a method of transformation, a form of intrusion. His lovers bore heroes and curses alike. Danae gave birth to Perseus, from the shining rain, Europa to Minos, from the bull, and in these stories, the mortal is often powerless, seduced, or tricked, or stolen. The divine right to EX was never equal. It was a hierarchy of power, masked as passion, And when Hera raged, it was not from jealousy, but from justice, from the knowledge that EX was being used as conquest, not as communion. Dionysus, too, offers contradictions. His rites involve wine and song, but also tearing apart and becoming wild and free, and yet bound to something ancient. EX in his cult was ecstasy in its original sense. Ecstasis, standing outside the self, leaving behind the mind, the city, the name, to become something else. Not man, not beast, but something blooming in between. And the women who followed him, the maenads, were not debauched, as their critics claimed, but reclaiming something stolen in silence. Their cries in the night were not madness, but memory. The memory of mothers who had no voice, of brides exchanged like cattle, of girls whose first experience of EX was pain hidden. Behind the guise of duty, the myths of the Amazons speak of women who refused this script. They lived apart, rode horses, wielded spears, kept men only for reproduction or ritual. And even in myth, they were feared not for their violence, but for their autonomy, for saying no, for saying yes on their own terms. And the Greeks both idolized and demonized them, calling them noble and monstrous in the same breath. For what is more terrifying to a culture of male inheritance than a woman who needs no man to claim her power in the festivals? Thesmophoria, women, dared without men to honor Demeter and Persephone, and buried pigs as offerings to the underworld, a symbol of fertility and rot of life and decay. EX was folded into the soil, into myth, into grain, into silence. What happened there was not recorded, but it echoed in male anxiety. They joked, they feared, they guessed, but they did not know. And what is unknown becomes holy or haunted. And sometimes both the heterae stood outside the domestic norm. They were courtesans, companions, intellectuals, often educated more than wives. They could debate, recite poetry, shape opinion. They were seen in public. They dined with men. They chose their patrons. They were both respected and reviled, for they moved through EX, not as victims, but as artisans. They knew the body as language and wielded it with precision, and yet for all their power they had protection. They were admired, but never safe, because power in EX, especially in a woman, was always seen as borrowed, and any moment could be revoked by blade, by law, by silence. The boys, too, were part of this unspoken net pederasty. Was praised in theory a bond between man and youth, mentor and mentee. But beneath the poetry lay danger, the boundary between education and exploitation, blurred by age, by rank, by silence. And the boy had no voice. Only later, perhaps, would the man reflect and wonder where love ended and wound began. In the myths, Ganymede is taken by Zeus, made immortal cupbearer and beauty forever. But was he willing? Did he have choice? The vase painters show him resisting, running his eyes wide and fearful. But the poets speak of glory, of honor, of divine favor, and the dissonance hums like a low chord never resolved. And in this tension lies a great silence, the silence of all who were taken, and told it was a gift in the sanctuaries of Asclepius. People came for healing and dreams. They slept in sacred spaces, hoping the god would appear and whisper cures. And among the symbols of snakes and rods, there were undercurrents of EX, not explicit but implied. The body mattered. Desire mattered. Wholeness was not only physical, but spiritual. And EX was part of the wound and the balm in initiation rites from Eleusis to Samothrace. Young people were led blindfolded, underground, surrounded by chance and touch and mystery. And when they emerged, they were changed. The mysteries were never written, never told, but always carried, like a heat beneath the skin. And many who underwent them said they no longer feared death, perhaps because they had met it in the form of EX, raw and veiled, and eternal, and not always kind. In the halls where philosophers walked and argued beneath stone colonnades, EX was not dismissed, but dissected, reframed, not as animal impulse, but as gateway to truth. Plato, in his dialogues, shaped EX into a ladder, a rising motion from flesh, to form from longing, to love, to something more refined, more eternal. He wrote in the Symposium of the Banquet, where men spoke of Eros, not as a god, of desire alone, but as the impulse toward beauty, toward completion. The speeches move from body to soul, from individual to universal. And in Diotima's voice, we hear the ascent. She teaches that one begins by loving a single beautiful body, then all beautiful bodies, then the beauty of minds, then of laws and knowledge, until at last one grasps the form of beauty itself, pure, eternal, unchanging EX. In this ascent is both origin and means. It is not shamed, but transmuted, a spark that kindles the soul to climb. And yet that climb requires denying the very body that gave the spark. So even as EX is honored, it is also feared, as tether, as distraction, as reminder of mortality. Socrates is said to have resisted temptation, immune to bodily hunger, so he might hunger for wisdom instead. And Alcibiades, in his drunken confession, speaks of loving Socrates' body and mind, but being spurned, not with disdain, but with coldness, a redirection of energy from skin, speech from kiss to question. And this tension between desire and denial runs through the academy like a quiet current. And yet not all philosophers agreed. The Epicureans, for instance, did not scorn pleasure. They did not elevate EX to divinity, but saw it as part of life, to be enjoyed with balance and without fear. Their garden was open to women, to slaves, to those often barred from Stoic discourse. They spoke gently of desire as natural, but warned against obsession. For when EX becomes a god, it can also become a tyrant. The Stoics, meanwhile, sought control, not elimination of EX. They aimed to master the self, to live according to nature, which included EX. But within virtue, they believed passion was not evil, but needed reason to steer it. Otherwise, it became pathos, suffering, and deviation. Aristotle saw EX as part of friendship, especially the kind rooted in virtue. He distinguished between friendships of pleasure, of utility, and of the good. And though he did not center EX in his ethics, he acknowledged its power to bond, to inspire, to corrupt, depending on its aim and balance. In medical texts of Hippocrates and Galen, EX is treated as fun, Shen as fluid and fire. Women's wombs were said to wander, if not satisfied, causing hysteria, while men's semen was seen as the essence of vitality. Too much drained them, too little poisoned them. Balance again was the mantra, not abstinence, nor excess. And in these frameworks, we see how EX was interwoven with health, with harmony, with cosmic rhythm, and yet always hovering is the question of control. Who gets to define EX? Who gets to speak of it publicly, to shape its meanings? For while men debated, women lived its consequences, often silently. The priestess who broke her vow, the wife accused of adultery, the girl married too young, the slave who could not refuse. Their voices are missing, and in their absence, EX becomes abstract, elevated beyond the flesh it inhabits. And yet, their absence is a presence, a haunting gap in the discourse, a wound, unaddressed. Even in myth, Athena was born without, mother from Zeus's head, fully formed, armored, untouched by EX, a symbol of reason, untainted by desire. Yet her wisdom carries the weight of what is denied. And Aphrodite, her opposite, born of sea foam from severed flesh, is the embodiment of EX. Uncontained, unpredictable, both giver and destroyer. of harmony. And between them lies the spectrum of how the Greeks wrestled with EX, sacred and profane, divine and base. And in art we see this tension played out in marble, and paint the Kuros statues, youthful male nudes, poised in beauty and strength, the Korai clothed, veiled, modest, suggesting what lies beneath. In vase paintings, EX is explicit, playful, ceremonial, sometimes violent, sometimes tender, a mirror to life and fantasy alike. And in theater too, EX emerges, tragedy and comedy alike, wrestle with desire, with its joys and costs. Euripides often portrays women who challenge the norms, who suffer and rage and act, not always nobly, but humanly. Phaedra, who desires her stepson, Medea, who kills her children in betrayal. And in these stories, EX is the spark, not the whole fire, but the one that lights the fuel. And in Aristophanes' comedies, EX is political women band together, withholding it, to stop war in Lysistrata, or mock the trials of marriage and market in assembly. Women laughter becomes a form of truth, a way to expose the absurdity of how society boxes EX and those who bear it. And so from the symposium to the stage, from scroll to statue, EX, in ancient Greece, was never one thing. It was philosophy and physiology, poetry and power, a force to be shaped, explained, feared, longed for, and like Eros himself, winged, elusive, always fleeing definition. Beyond the polished words of philosophers and the carved myths of poets, EX in ancient Greece unfolded in courtyards and kitchens, in whispered warnings and stolen glances, in expectations too heavy for youth, in silence too loud for age. The young Athenian girl who reached the age of 14 was seen not as a child, but as a vessel to secure alliances, a womb for legacy. Her EX, not her own, but bartered by father, measured by dowry, and judged by chastity. Her husband, likely twice her age, saw in her not a partner, but a duty. And so their nights were cloaked, not in affection, but obligation. Her curiosity, if voiced, would be met with shame or prayer to Artemis, to guard what must not stir. Too soon, meanwhile, her husband's own EX had likely bloomed early, nurtured by hetaerai, courtesans trained in wit and art, whose freedom was illusion, but whose skill made them companions for thought. As well as body, the wife ruled the oikos, the household. The hetaera ruled the symposium, each woman bound, but in different chains. And in the streets, EX whispered, between slats of shutters, women fetching water at dawn might exchange jokes or sighs, knowing what waited or what never came. And slaves, their bodies, not their own, carried the heaviest burden of EX. For them consent was a luxury and violation, routine, their pain unmarked by law. And so EX in the polis was structured, layered, ranked. Who could love, who could touch, who could speak? Even boys were not untouched by this lattice. The practice of pederasty, glorified in art and text, joined older citizen men with adolescent boys, not merely for EX, but mentorship in theory, in poetry. It was idealized as a bond of learning, of aspiration. But in truth, the boy's voice rarely recorded. What did he feel when approached by the man in the gymnasium? Did he blush? Did he fear? Did he understand? And when he grew, would he forget or repeat? And so the cycle turned, clothed in custom, glossed in honor, but rooted still in hierarchy. Even weddings lacked romance, often arranged more for fortune than feeling the ceremony. A transaction, the feast more for family than couple, and the bride would burn her childhood toys at Artemis's altar, marking the end of play, and start of duty, while the groom would offer sacrifices to ensure fertility, not joy. And EX within marriage was rarely about pleasure for women. Pleasure, if it came, was a whispered thing, a shared secret between friends, or discovered alone in darkness. Rituals around fertility, like the thesmophoria, allowed women a rare space among themselves. 3 days of fasting and ceremony, invoking Demeter and Persephone, speaking perhaps in metaphors, but sharing pain and longing. The barren woman, the grieving mother, the wife with no voice. Here they might find echoes, and in mystery cults, like those of Dionysus, or the Eleusinian rites. EX took other forms. Ecstasy, transcendence, a loss of self that some saw as divine and others as dangerous. Women danced by torchlight, masked, crowned with ivy, screaming not in fear but release, shaking off names and roles and letting Eros move as he would. And in those moments, perhaps, X became theirs, not shaped by law or lineage, but instinct and fire. And yet even there, eyes watched for women who danced too wildly, spoke too freely, were soon corrected or cursed. The line between freedom and shame, as thin as a veil. And for men, EX was often a proving ground, a way to assert power, conquest, not just of cities, but of beds. The warrior who returned from battle expected more than bread and wine. He wanted affirmation that he still ruled his hearth. And so EX could become a performance, a ritual of dominance, even within love. For to be too tender, too yielding, was seen as weakness, especially among men who sought the ideal of control, and so many cloaked gentleness, in jest or drank to speak what they could not sober. And in the plays of Menander, the new comedy of the late period, we glimpse daily lives where EX causes confusion, comedy pain. Love the young man who falls for a slave girl, the father who discovers his child from a tryst years past, the wife who suspects betrayal. These were stories not of gods, but of neighbors, of people who longed and lied and tried and sometimes failed. And so EX, in ancient Greece, was not one experience but many, often dependent on birth, on gender, on chance. It could be sacred or mundane, desired or dreaded, given or taken. And always it left marks, some visible, some not. The wife who never knew pleasure, the hetera who knew too much, the boy who grew into silence, the priest who questioned and wept, the lawmaker who tried to codify longing and found it slipped through ink like water. And in letters that survive on papyri, we find fragments of love, poems half faded, scribbled notes from soldiers to wives, erotic spells meant to bind a lover's heart, small echoes of big feelings, glimpses into moments when EX was not concept or policy, but heartbeat and breath and fear and thrill. And as time passed, and Rome rose to eclipse the polis, Greek views of EX shifted again, absorbing new laws, new gods, new taboos. But the whispers remained, the myths were retold, the statues endured, and the question stayed, what is EX? Who owns it? Who decides? And in each era, the answers changed, and yet never settled. For how can one define something so tied to the soul, to the skin, to the self, and not risk losing its fire? To understand EX in ancient Greece is to unravel a tapestry woven with contradiction, sanctity and silence, desire and duty, public, ritual and private yearning. It is not enough to say that EX was accepted or repressed, for the truth lay in its constant tension, in how the polis sought to control what the body could not ignore. EX was not merely a physical act, it was tied to fertility, to legacy, to religion, to war. It dictated who could speak, who could inherit, who could rule. It informed architecture, the design of homes that separated male and female quarters. It shaped language, the euphemisms, the metaphors, the coded humor of comedies, and the solemn gravity of oaths sworn on love, and it marked time from the first shedding of a girl's blood to the burial rites that marked a widow's celibacy. Life's rhythms were counted in moments, when EX was gained, lost, regretted, forbidden. The law spoke of it obliquely, through categories of shame, honor, consent, and debt. Yet, beneath the parchment, real people breathed, and faltered, and tried. The young man who sought advice from a friend on how to approach his intended with grace, not force the widow who quietly visited the temple of Aphrodite in the night, praying not for a child but for touch. The foreign woman sold into bondage, whose body became a battleground for other men's power. The philosopher who questioned the place of pleasure in virtue and never found a neat answer. The boy who refused the advances of an older man and was mocked, not for refusal but for supposed arrogance. The girl who felt something stir in her when watching another girl dance at a festival and feared she was cursed or mad or alone. And in these unnamed stories lost to history, EX was not a symbol. It was lived, flawed, complex human. The statues that remain do not speak, but we see in them hints of what mattered. A hand resting gently on another's hip, a gaze cast downward, a curve too soft to be mere decor. The pottery that shows embraces and pursuit, laughter and submission, tells tales both mythic and mundane. And in the silence of tombs we read what was not said. A woman buried with mirrors and perfumes, a man with weapons and wine, a boy with a flute and tea. Worn sandals. What did they long for? What did they hide? And the gods watched all of it, for no deity was neutral in matters of EX. Aphrodite stirred hearts and ruined cities. Eros pierced even immortals. Artemis guarded chastity, but was not untouched by stories of pursuit and vengeance. Dionysus offered release through frenzy, and Demeter mourned not only the abduction of her daughter, but the EX that marked her child's transformation from maiden to wife. The myths were mirrors of mortal confusion, and the mortals echoed divine chaos. And through centuries, the conversation around EX never ceased. It shifted from symposium to academy, from altar to theater, from papyrus to parchment. The Stoics preached restraint. The Epicureans sought balance. The Christians who would come later would demonize what the Greeks had debated. But even they borrowed the language, the metaphors. The fears for EX, once named, is never unspoken again. And today, when we look back, we must be careful not to romanticize, nor condemn, but to witness, to try to hear the voices beneath the marble, and ink the girl who trembled on her wedding night, the hetera, who spoke with poets, but died alone, the soldier who held another's hand, before marching, the priestess, who dreamed of a face she could never name, and the generations that came after inherited not only temples and texts, but the questions. What is EX? What does it mean to be touched? To touch, to be wanted or denied, to give with joy or take with pain. And those questions linger, even now, in our stories, in our silences, in the way we teach our children or choose not to, in the art we make, and the jokes we tell, and the rules we write, and the ones we break. The ancient Greeks did not solve the mystery of EX. Lived it, shaped, it was shaped by it, and so are we. And in the stillness before sleep, when the world is quiet and the mind drifts, it is perhaps no wonder that our thoughts return to such things, to the moments when we felt most seen or most hidden, to the brush of a hand, to the sting of a word, to the ache of distance to the fire of longing. And in that soft, dark, we are not so far from them. From the girl who gazed at the stars and wondered if her heart was wrong. From the man who carved love into stone because words were too fragile. From the child who asked a question and got only silence. And for the poet who knew that EX like life is messy, beautiful, sacred, profane, and never, ever simple. And perhaps it is in that understanding, in that quiet compassion, that we finally approach truth, not as scholars, not as judges, but as humans, reaching across time to touch another soul and whisper, I see. You, I understand.